Sandor Clegane could not recall a time when his brother's shadow had not cast itself over him. In their youth, Gregor loomed like a living nightmare, wordless rage coiled in his towering frame, eyes as cold as a moonless night, as unfeeling as death itself. Sandor's earliest memory was not the taste of bread or the sight of his father, but the crackling of fire against the side of his face. The searing heat, the acrid scent of charred flesh, the merciless light dancing in Gregor's eyes, all of it had sunk into his bones, coloring every moment of Sandor's life since. And always there was the fear. It accompanied him like a second skin, and in quiet moments he would catch himself shaking for no reason except the dread memory of Gregor's cruelty. Yet that fear had not brought him to his knees, it had shaped him into something harsh, ruthless, and nearly unbreakable. It was only the flickering, mocking knowledge that one day he might have to face that monster again. He stood in a torchlit hallway of the Red Keep, and there was an odd tautness in his jaw as he waited. The air in King's Landing was thick with the stench of the unwashed, of rotted food and waste that snaked through the labyrinth of streets. Within the castle walls, perfumed ladies and skulking servants passed him by, some whispering or tittering behind slender fingers. Even here, the heat of the day never truly abated, and Sandor could feel the sweat beating on his temples beneath the heavy cloak draped over his broad shoulders. He was waiting for a summons that did not come, some final order from the Lannisters or the king before the night was done. He turned his head slightly, hearing the echo of footsteps behind him, but it was only a pair of guards stumbling back from the ale they'd stolen. He exhaled a grunt and let the tension seep from his shoulders. A part of him longed for a moment of pure silence, away from all the vices of King's Landing, away from the deafening shrieks of hatred that lived in his own mind. He could not remember how long ago it had been since Ned Stark lost his head, only that Joffrey had crowed like a triumphant cock when it happened, the boy king's laughter rebounding across the plaza. Sandor had been there, unsmiling, enveloped by an odd emptiness. He remembered Sansa's scream, how her face had been so white it seemed carved from marble. All her softness turned to shock. It wasn't her father's death that truly haunted Sandor. Death was as common to him as air, but the look in the girl's eyes. It made him think of the helplessness he had once felt. He had tried so hard never to see that reflection of himself again. That same night, he had come upon Gregor in the small courtyard behind the Great Hall. The Mountain had returned from one of Tywin Lannister's errands in the Riverlands, and his armor was splattered with blood and gore. Gregor's monstrous helm was tucked under his arm, revealing a face that looked as though it were hewn from stone. In the torchlight, his eyes flickered with barely constrained ferocity, as though even in the stillness of the castle keep, he was searching for something or someone to break. "Brother," Gregor had muttered in greeting, as if the word were a foul taste on his tongue. Sandor remembered staring at him. He recalled the tense coil in his belly. So many times, he had yearned to drive a sword through that broad chest, to quell that unstoppable fury once and for all. Yet old habits were hard to break. He managed only a nod, then walked on. The moment passed, and the boy that once had cowered from burning coals was again overshadowed by the man of nightmares. Word spread rapidly of Gregor's latest atrocities. The man had been unleashed on the Riverlands to pillage, burn, and terrorize in Tywin's name, sowing fear among the common folk to destabilize the North's allies. Whispers said the Mountain had torched entire villages, ravished helpless villagers, killed men by the dozens, women by the handful. Such rumors never seemed to bother anyone in the Lannister court, but served instead as a testament to the house's might. Yet Sandor heard the frightened words on the lips of stable boys, scullions, and passing knights who muttered in corners about the Mountain's unstoppable wrath. That wrath had once found its target in a small boy's face, and now the man that boy had become found himself haunted by the knowledge that he alone understood the depth of Gregor's cruelty better than any living soul. The day it finally happened was a day like any other. The sun hammered down onto King's Landing, turning the air heavy and thick. The city's denizens sweated and complained, cursing the stifling heat. Down in Flea Bottom, the stench of rot and refuse was worse than usual, and the gold cloaks had to drag away a body so decayed it no longer smelled human. Within the Red Keep, the tension of war was inescapable. Robb Stark had won a victory in the Whispering Wood, capturing Jaime Lannister. Tywin Lannister's fury had seeped through every corridor. The king's council had met in secret after secret, planning how to crush the northern upstart. Joffrey, scarcely beyond boyhood, strutted through the halls barking orders as if he were born to lead armies. Cersei hovered near him, scolding him with sweet words that carried a sharp edge. Tyrion Lannister had yet to arrive as the Hand. So chaos reigned in the small council, each man calling for a different strategy, each desperate to show strength in the face of the so-called young wolf. Sandor had wanted to avoid the Great Hall that morning. He had no desire to watch Joffrey crow from his new seat, nor did he care to see Sansa brought in to kneel at the foot of the Iron Throne. He had begun to sense something inside him shift whenever he saw her. Pity, perhaps. Pity for that frightened, abused bird locked in a gilded cage. It made him uneasy and short-tempered. Yet his duty bound him to remain close to the king, and so he found himself near Joffrey's dais when Gregor arrived, accompanied by a handful of men clad in the Lannister red. Gregor looked more like a giant than ever, forced to stoop slightly to pass beneath the massive door frame. He carried an axe in one hand, a battered wooden shield in the other, spoils from some poor bastard who had dared stand in his path. When Joffrey saw him, the boy king's pale eyes glimmered with a savage delight. "Ser Gregor," Joffrey called, his voice echoing. "My mother's told me so many tales of your triumphs. I hear you've made the Riverlands tremble." The question was laced with that arrogant cruelty that only Joffrey could muster. Gregor gave a curt nod as though bored. "The villages have burned," he said in a voice deeper than a war horn. Lord Tywin's orders were followed. Sandor stood rigid, arms folded against his chest. His gaze flicked over the fresh dents in Gregor's armor, the dried blood caking his gauntlets. A shadow passed behind the mountain's eyes, and in it Sandor saw the reflection of a boundless, senseless hunger to inflict pain. It made Sandor's stomach turn, though he worked to keep his face blank. Joffrey ascended from the throne, ignoring the squeak of metal from the swords that made up its back. "You shall be rewarded for your loyal service," he said, stepping down. "Bring forth the wine. My good dog has earned a drink." A servant hurried to present Gregor with a goblet. The mountain downed the wine in a few swallows. The color of it stained his lips momentarily, more like fresh blood than anything else. He let out a grunt of satisfaction, then shifted his attention to Sandor. That gaze made something inside the Hound coil like a snake. For an instant, Sandor thought he saw the flicker of a memory in Gregor's dark eyes, an unspoken warning, a brutal possession. "You are mine to torment if I wish." The older brother's lip curled, and Sandor felt the old fear stir. But behind that fear rose anger, a hot, potent anger that nearly had him reach for the sword at his belt. Joffrey was prattling on about putting Gregor at the head of more men, sending him out again to raid more villages. The king's words faded to a low roar in Sandor's ears as he stared at his brother. The memories came rushing, the flames, the helplessness, the scar that still burned at times like a brand. Gregor had stolen Sandor's life from the moment he had smashed a toy knight into a brazier of coals and then pressed his little brother's face into them. That day, the boy who had laughed and played had died, replaced by the hollow man who now stood, half a monster, leashed to a petty, cruel king. The truth lodged in Sandor's throat like a shard of bone. He noticed that Gregor was smirking at him, the corner of his mouth lifting in silent mockery as Joffrey's words continued in that droning, self-important manner. Something inside Sandor snapped in that moment, a silent, sudden break. He couldn't say if it was the knowledge that more innocents would suffer under Gregor's hand, or if it was the hateful memory of Sansa's terrified face. Maybe it was just years upon years of carrying that singed flesh and burying his terror in cold cynicism. Perhaps all at once, those pressures collided and an unstoppable storm rose in Sandor's heart. All he knew was that his hand went to the hilt of his sword. A hush fell over the hall. Joffrey, noticing the abrupt silence, halted his speech. Courtiers and knights alike froze in confusion. Gregor's eyes followed Sandor's motion, and he shifted his weight, as if he, too, sensed something new in the air. The Hound's breath was ragged as he forced himself to speak. "Your Grace," he said, bowing his head slightly. "If I may, Ser Gregor has committed great acts in your name. Perhaps he would not mind a little demonstration." He didn't know where the words came from, only that they poured out before he could stop them. Joffrey raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A demonstration?" the boy asked, crossing his arms. "He's proven himself on battlefields. Why should we want more? Sometimes the court needs reminding," Sandor said thickly, raising his head to fix Gregor with a challenging stare. "We have knights from across the realm here. Let us see what sort of beast your dog truly is." He heard murmurs in the crowd. Lord Baelish was there, leaning on the dais with a half-smile. The man's mocking eyes flicked between Sandor and Gregor. Cersei stood near the throne, her lips parted in surprise. Pycelle was trembling in the corner. Sandor knew this was madness. Provoking Gregor in front of the entire court was like sticking his arm in a dragon's mouth. But the moment had arrived, whether by fate or folly, and he could not keep silent anymore. Joffrey hesitated, but curiosity glowed in his face. He gestured for everyone to clear a space in the hall. The clink and shuffle of courtiers and guards moving back reverberated. Gregor's scowl deepened. The Lannister men shifted, uncertain, but none dared speak or question the king's pleasure. When the floor was cleared, Joffrey swept a hand theatrically. "Fine," he said, unable to hide his grin. "Let us see a show." Gregor turned fully toward Sandor. The difference in their sizes was stark. The mountain was nearly 7 feet of muscle and brutality, while Sandor, though large and strong himself, looked smaller by comparison. Yet there was a crackle in Sandor's gray eyes that Gregor did not expect. Sandor unsheathed his sword, the metallic hiss piercing the hush. Gregor dropped the battered shield to the ground with a clang and took a step closer, each thud of his boots echoing like distant thunder. The tension in the hall was palpable. Many knights stood with hands gripping the pommels of their own weapons, uncertain if they might need to intervene. Sandor swallowed, tasting a dryness in his throat. He was unarmored except for boiled leather and a half-helm, not even the Hound's sigil helm that he sometimes wore. Gregor, on the other hand, was still in his plate and mail from the Riverlands, though battered. It afforded him significant protection, including those massive pauldrons that gave his shoulders a monstrous breadth. The difference between them could not be greater, yet Sandor felt not a flicker of doubt in that moment. Anger and something raw, determination, perhaps, drove him forward. The clang of steel against steel shattered the silence. Gregor advanced, swinging his axe in a savage arc that whistled through the air. Sandor threw himself aside, narrowly evading a blow that would have cleaved him in two. He countered with a slash to Gregor's side, but the older brother's reflexes were as formidable as his strength, and he twisted, turning the blade away with a flick of his gauntlet. Sparks flew. Sandor felt his arms jolt from the impact. Gregor was so goddamn strong. Joffrey laughed, high and cruel, from the dais. The courtiers let out gasps and murmurs. Some part of Sandor burned with shame that the spectacle had become entertainment for the Boy King. But the rest of him needed to do this. If there was a shred of justice or peace left to him, it lay in confronting the living embodiment of his nightmares. Gregor attacked again, driving Sandor back with blow after blow. The ring of steel echoed in the great hall as the two men crashed together, each strike a testament to the savage brand of swordsmanship they had mastered over years of war. Gregor's size and raw power were indisputable, but Sandor had fought in countless melees and had found a brutal grace of his own. He spun away from a decapitating strike, letting his sword flick in and out, scoring a rent in Gregor's breastplate. The blow was not enough to pierce flesh, but it left a jagged scratch in the plate. Gregor snarled in response, surging forward with a relentless fury. Metal ground on metal. Sparks danced around their feet. Onlookers edged away, fearful that the fight might spill beyond the cleared space. Sandor's muscles burned with the effort of each parry. His breath came in ragged bursts. Blood drummed in his ears. A savage strike caught him near the shoulder, and he felt the painful force even through the boiled leather, staggering. Gregor pressed, seeking to end the fight. The sheer momentum of the mountain swing hammered Sandor's blade aside and slammed into his ribs. Sandor felt the copper tang of blood in his mouth, but somehow he stayed on his feet. Rage lent him strength. He bared his teeth and lunged in a wild, reckless thrust, burying his blade into the gap between Gregor's breastplate and gorget. For a moment, time seemed to halt. Gregor let out a choking gasp. Sandor growled, driving the blade deeper with all the strength he had. Blood welled and spattered across the white stones of the floor. Gregor's face contorted with fury, yet in his eyes flared something alien and alarming: fear. The mountain reeled back, yanking himself off Sandor's sword. His axe clattered to the floor. He reached up, trying to clamp a gauntlet hand over the wound in his neck, but the blood flowed too swiftly. It stained his surcoat, bright and thick, shocking in its color. The hall erupted into chaos. Some screamed, others gasped or shouted for guards. Joffrey's shrill voice cut through the din, calling for them to stop, to see Sandor, but it was already too late. Gregor Clegane staggered once, growled a final curse that came out as a bloody gurgle, and collapsed. Sandor lowered his sword, gulping air. He stood over the massive corpse, legs trembling from the effort. The hush that fell then was deeper than any silence the great hall had ever known. In that stillness, Sandor looked at the crumpled heap of steel and flesh that had once been his greatest fear. And in a moment of breathless calm, the fact that he had done it rang in his mind like a bell. Gregor was dead. He had killed the mountain. The shock felt like cold water rushing through his veins. Something inside him twisted. Was it triumph, horror, or both? Then the world roared back to life. Joffrey shrieked for guards. Men rushed in from every corner. Half a dozen spears pointed at Sandor's chest. He did not fight them. He simply stood there, staring at his brother's body, half expecting it to rise. But it did not. The last memory he would ever have of Gregor was that still, bloody mass at his feet. They dragged him away in chains. Cersei's voice cut through the mayhem, commanding them to lock Sandor in the black cells to await the king's justice for this treason. Some courtiers were agape, others cowered. Peter Baelish smirked as though he had just witnessed a most entertaining show. And Sandor realized with a distant sense of irony that if he survived this, his entire life would change. In the darkness of the black cells, time stretched into an endless night. The stench of rot and filth pressed close. Chains bit into his wrists and ankles. He had seen men lose their minds down here, and he knew it would not take long if he gave in to despair. But he did not. Even as his wounds ached and the bruise on his ribs throbbed, he held onto one thought. He had killed Gregor. No one could take that from him, not even the gods. Sometimes he caught himself letting out a low laugh that sounded more like a growl. That monstrous, overshadowing presence that had haunted him for decades was gone. He expected execution. Joffrey's anger would demand nothing less. But days passed with no summons. Once, a jailer came to slip a bowl of stale water and hard bread under the door. Sandor asked for news. The jailer sneered. They say Tywin's raging at Harrenhal. The queen's trying to figure how best to handle you. Some say you might be forced to take the black. Others say the king wants your head. Then the jailer left and Sandor was alone again. His rest was fitful, broken by the squeaks of rats and the echo of dripping water. He refused to let fear claim him. If death was to be his reward for slaying the mountain, so be it. There was a small, savage satisfaction that he had at least chosen his end on his own terms. On what might have been the 6th or 7th day, he was dragged out of his cell and up the winding stone steps into the Red Keep's courtyard. Bright sunlight stabbed into his eyes. He was unwashed, unshaven, and blood from his neglected wound had dried into his clothes. Guards shoved him forward, leading him to the throne room. The great hall was crowded as if a major trial or spectacle was about to take place. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, wearing a self-satisfied sneer. Cersei stood to one side, her green eyes watchful and unreadable. There were many lords and ladies in attendance, some from the Crownlands, others who had arrived from distant corners of the realm to pay homage, likely unaware they would witness this drama. The King's Guard ringed the dais. Sandor's eyes flicked over them. Ser Meryn Trant with his simpering expression, Ser Boros blunt-looking bored. None of them would dare speak for the man who had murdered Gregor in plain view of the court. Joffrey's high, reedy voice echoed. Sandor Clegane, he announced, leaning forward, you are accused of murdering Ser Gregor Clegane, a knight of the realm, sworn in my service. You have committed treason against me, your king. Tell us, Hound. Why should I not have your head struck from your shoulders this instant? Sandor's mouth was dry, but he stood straight, chains clanking around his wrists. He looked at the boy king, feeling contempt churn in his belly. A flicker of movement in the corner of his vision drew his eye. He saw Sansa there, pale and terrified, her hands clasped in front of her. That sight made him pause. He had little love for any at this court, but something about that girl's unwavering innocence despite her hardships struck a chord in him. In that moment, he decided that if he were to speak, it would be the truth no matter how Joffrey reacted. I did kill Gregor, Sandor said, letting his voice carry. He was no knight, he was a butcher and a murderer who spread terror in your name. I served you, but I could not abide him any longer. If my life is the price, so be it. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. No one spoke so bluntly to the king. Joffrey's lip curled, his hand clenching the arm of the throne. Dog, he spat, you think you can justify your crime by insulting my greatest champion? Gregor was loyal and you betrayed me. Your cowardice and disobedience in slaying your own blood, a cough interrupted Joffrey's tirade. It came from the shadows near the dais. Tyrion Lannister had finally arrived in King's Landing, it seemed, and though not yet officially serving his hand, the dwarf had a certain cunning about him that no one could deny. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, stepping forward with his uneven gait. "Might we consider the consequences of executing Sandor Clegane? After all, House Clegane was granted lands and titles by your grandfather, the late Lord Tywin, and they have served your house for years. With the heir Gregor now dead, would it not be prudent to see if Sandor is indeed the rightful heir, or is there another? Such matters can be delicate, and we are in the midst of war. Perhaps your Grace would show his mercy and consider an alternative to simple execution." Joffrey's face twisted with annoyance. He seemed ready to snap at Tyrion, but Cersei laid a hand on her son's shoulder. "My brother has a point," she said smoothly, her own voice measured. "There are pressing issues in the realm. If every knight who quarreled with another were executed, we'd soon have no knights left. Perhaps we might dispense with the more savage aspects of justice. The court may favor an alternative solution." Sandor realized that Cersei did not care for his well-being. This was politics, pure and simple. With Gregor dead, House Clegane's future was uncertain. The lands and castle known as Clegane's Keep needed a new lord. Executing Sandor would either revert those holdings to the crown or some other favored house, but it might also anger Tywin Lannister, who might see it as a waste of a valuable asset or a stain on the family's ability to keep men loyal. The last thing the crown needed was more unrest amid the War of the Five Kings. So, with a sudden clarity, Sandor understood that his life hung on a slender thread of political utility. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Joffrey's eyes flicked between his mother and Tyrion, clearly vexed that his immediate thirst for vengeance might be tempered by caution. But he wanted to appear decisive and kingly. "Very well," he said, leaning back. "We shall not kill the dog." He paused, letting disappointment spread among some who were eager for blood. "But he has offended me," Joffrey continued. "He has offended the crown by spilling the blood of my knight in my own hall. He shall forfeit any claim to titles or lands and be stripped of knighthood, if ever he had such. He shall be banished from my city, never to return on pain of death. Let him be gone from my sight." The pronouncement hung in the air. Sandor stared at the boy king, uncertain if this was real. He had expected a swift end, not exile. But the guards were already stepping forward to unshackle him, at Cersei's subtle signal. He heard them muttering about him being put on a horse and escorted from the city. The entire court erupted into a frenzy of whispers. Tyrion gave Sandor a sideways glance, as though evaluating him for future use. Cersei's expression was calculating. Sansa, he glimpsed her in the crowd, looked more relieved than anything else, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was the only comfort Sandor allowed himself. Within the hour, Sandor was led from the Red Keep, chains removed, but flanked by a dozen Lannister guards with crossbows. He had not even been allowed to bathe or gather his possessions. He was half-sore, bloodied, and trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. Outside the castle gates, they brought him a horse, an old, sway-backed mare, as an insult. One of the guards gave him a rough shove. "Get on," the man growled. "Ride away from here and never come back. The king's orders." Sandor considered the crossbows aimed at him from the battlements. He could possibly kill a guard or two, but that would be the end of him. So he spat on the ground, pulled himself onto the horse, and took the reins in his calloused hands. The gates opened. The hot air of King's Landing gave way to the open road. With a last glance at the Red Keep scarlet towers, he kicked the mare's flanks and trotted away, leaving the city, his old life, and the monstrous ghost of his brother behind. For days, he wandered aimlessly. He had no coin, no supplies other than a half-rusted sword he'd managed to keep. Eventually, he found himself in the Stormlands, where the sky often threatened rain and the wind whipped over rolling hills. Rumors traveled faster than men on horseback. Small folk in taverns eyed him with a mix of fear and awe when they realized who he was. Some recognized the burn scar, the large build, the half-feral glare. He heard hushed whispers, "That's the Hound. They say he killed his own brother. King Joffrey banished him." Sandor ignored them. The old fear that had ruled his life was gone, but in its place was uncertainty. He had nowhere to go, no purpose. He felt strangely hollow. In one nameless village, he slept in a stable, offering to guard the farmer's chickens from foxes in exchange for a meal. The farmer eyed him warily but accepted. That night, Sandor sat with his back to the stable wall, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of trouble. Memories haunted him. Gregor's final look, the hush that followed his collapse, Joffrey's shrieks, the glint of Sansa's tearful eyes in the flickering torchlight. What did it matter? He was no one's sworn shield anymore. That might have been freeing if he had any notion of what to do with himself. Then came the rumors of war. Renly Baratheon had marched with his great host, forging alliances in the Reach, proclaiming himself king of the Seven Kingdoms. Stannis Baratheon had claimed Dragonstone and demanded loyalty under the banner of a flaming heart, brandishing letters that labeled Joffrey a product of incest. Robb Stark still warred in the Riverlands, collecting victories and forging the legend of the Young Wolf. Even Balon Greyjoy had crowned himself, harrying the coasts of the north. The realm was fracturing like a shattered mirror, each piece glittering with blood. Sandor had no desire to fight for any king or cause. Yet war was a hungry beast, and men with skill in arms were always in demand. He found himself drifting south, where the influence of House Tyrell had begun to coalesce around Renly Baratheon. In Highgarden's shadow, spearmen and knights gathered in large camps, drilling and preparing to march on King's Landing. One evening, Sandor rode close to a huge field that housed hundreds of green and gold tents. Banners emblazoned with the golden rose of House Tyrell fluttered in the breeze beside the stag of House Baratheon, crowned for Renly. The smell of cooking stews wafted in the air, and distant laughter and chatter told of soldiers who were either confident in their cause or foolish about the realities of war. He could have skirted around them and avoided the camps, but a combination of curiosity and the pangs of hunger led him closer. At a guard station, a knight in bright armor stepped forward. "Halt, traveler," the knight said. "What is your purpose here?" Sandor gave a shrug. "I heard King Renly was gathering swords," he said gruffly. "Might be I'm looking for honest work." The knight eyed him up and down, lingering on the scar. "Name?" Sandor paused. A part of him wanted to hide his identity, but he guessed it would matter little. "Sandor Clegane." Shock registered on the knight's face. The name carried weight, especially now. The knight raised a hand to beckon others. Sandor sighed, already regretting the choice. Before long, he was brought before a cluster of men wearing the livery of House Baratheon, likely some of Renly's advisors. They whispered among themselves, some wide-eyed, others curious. Word reached higher ears. Soon, a flamboyant knight with a pale complexion and dashing attire arrived, flanked by a retinue. Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers. Sandor recognized him from tournaments. The younger man had an air of polished charm and unwavering confidence. Loras studied Sandor with something bordering on suspicion. "You are the Hound," Loras said. "The man who killed the Mountain. And you come to seek King Renly's service?" Sandor stared evenly. "I come to see if there's a place for a sword for hire." Loras's lips curved slightly. "Renly's knights serve him out of love or duty, not coin." A bitter laugh escaped Sandor. "Men may say that, but everyone has a price, one way or another. I don't claim to love your king or any king. I've had enough of that nonsense." He expected his bluntness to earn him a swift dismissal. Instead, Loras's gaze flicked across the burn scar, then back to Sandor's eyes. "War is coming," the Knight of Flowers said quietly, "and every sword might matter. But King Renly will want to meet you before allowing a man of your reputation into his camp. I can arrange it if you wish." Sandor shrugged. "Lead the way." He was taken through the rows of tents until they reached a large pavilion at the center, striped in green and gold, fluttering with golden roses. There were armored guards, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of flowers. Loras had placed fresh blooms in vases, apparently. Seated at a table was Renly Baratheon himself, dressed in fine silks, his richly adorned crown resting on a cushion beside him. Next to him stood a tall woman in armor, her face plain but strong, eyes watchful, Brienne of Tarth, who had recently won Renly's favor. A small group of lords and courtiers stood at attention. Renly turned as Sandor was ushered in. "So," Renly said with a broad smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "we have a guest. Sandor Clegane, the Hound. Tales of your feat have reached even me. I hear you rid the world of the mountain that rides. Not a small accomplishment." Sandor folded his arms, ignoring the subtle discomfort in his ribs. He had it coming. A ripple of uneasy laughter spread among the courtiers. Renly studied Sandor's face, eyes lingering on the burn scar. "You've come seeking service?" he asked. Sandor nodded. I have no cause left to fight for, no illusions about kings or thrones. but I can swing a sword better than most." He regarded Renly's easy posture. "You might find me useful." Renly considered, rubbing his neatly trimmed beard. "I have many good swords," he said, "but few who have slain foes like Gregor Clegane. If my cause is to win this war, I'll need men of skill. My question is, can I trust you?" Sandor's lips curled into a sneer. "I served the Lannisters for years, if that matters. Banished for killing one of their own. Ask yourself what a man like me might do to your enemies if you give me reason." Brienne of Tarth, silent until then, spoke in a quiet but firm voice. "Your Grace, men who fight only for themselves can be dangerous, especially if they bear no love for your cause." Sandor glanced at her. There was a strength in her that reminded him of no one he'd ever met before. Pure, unwavering, and oddly unguarded. "I won't pretend to love any of you," he said. "I won't bow or kneel if I can help it, but I'm done with slaughter for slaughter's sake. If you want me to stand on a battlefield, I'll do it, but don't expect me to burn and pillage for your glory. I'm no dog on a leash, not anymore." Silence draped over the pavilion. Renly exchanged a glance with Loras Tyrell. The Knight of Flowers wore a subtle frown. Finally, Renly exhaled and said, "We shall see. I will not force a man to pledge false love. Fight for me, protect my vassals, do no harm to the innocent, and you shall have a place here. Cross me or do ill to my people, and I'll have your head. Are we clear?" Sandor inclined his head the closest he would come to a bow. Clear enough. And so it was that Sandor Clegane, formerly the Hound of House Lannister, found himself serving in Renly Baratheon's growing army. The days passed in a blur of training drills, scouting missions, and uneasy alliances. Knights who had once heard tales of his savagery gave him a wide berth. Others tested him with sneers or challenges, but a single glare usually silenced them. He had no friends except for the horse he managed to acquire, a half-decent destrier that responded well to his firm hand. Brienne of Tarth watched him carefully, evidently not trusting his motives, but she did not harass him. Loras Tyrell was polite but distant, though Sandor caught the man studying him with curiosity sometimes. The war progressed. Word came that Robb Stark had smashed another Lannister host in the west, capturing more highborn prisoners. Stannis was rumored to be building a fleet. Renly seemed intent on marching north soon to press his claim on the Iron Throne. One evening, as Sandor sat near a campfire sharpening his sword, he overheard two Tyrell soldiers discussing rumors that Tywin Lannister had regrouped and was moving south to meet Renly's forces. The men shivered at the thought of Tywin's wrath. "But they say that mountain of his is gone," one soldier said, voice full of relief. "Slain by his own brother." The other soldier frowned. "Aye, but we have that brother now. Best be careful. A dog can always bite the hand that feeds him." Sandor listened indifferent. He had grown used to such talk. When Renly finally marched, the host was vast and glittering, full of color and pageantry. Knights in shining armor, banners streaming in the breeze, ladies riding in litters. To Sandor, it looked more like a tourney than a campaign. But the men were fierce in their devotion to Renly, who carried himself with that same charismatic grace. The aura around him was one of confidence and camaraderie. That night, they camped near a broad river. Renly hosted a feast, inviting lords to dine in a grand pavilion. Sandor avoided most feasts, but hunger drew him toward the edge of the crowd where he could at least secure a decent meal. He was gnawing on a leg of roast chicken when Brienne approached. She wore a simple tunic over her mail, her large figure casting a long shadow in the torchlight. "Sandor Clegane," she said, voice level. "His Grace would speak with you." He frowned. "What for?" She shrugged. "He didn't say, but I'd not keep him waiting if I were you." Sandor wiped grease from his mouth and followed her. Inside the pavilion, the air smelled of wine and roasted meat. Renly sat at a table, crown gleaming on his dark hair, while Loras Tyrell and a few other lords lounged on cushions, sharing jests. Renly beckoned Sandor over. "My lords," Renly said with a grin, "behold the man who killed Ser Gregor Clegane. How many of you can claim such a feat in your songs?" A few laughed politely, though some looked uneasy. Sandor noticed a smaller man with a pointed beard, studying him with a cunning gleam. Likely a lesser lord of the Reach. "A fearsome deed, indeed," the man said. "Yet I've heard that Gregor was unstoppable. How did you manage such a thing, Ser Sandor?" Sandor scowled. "Don't call me Ser. I'm no knight." Renly clapped a hand on the table, still in a jovial mood from the wine. "They say you despise knights," he said. "You may find many of mine are not so bad." But as my lord has asked, we are curious. How does one bring down a monster like Gregor? A hush fell. Sandor thought of that moment in King's Landing, the blind rage, the unstoppable impetus of hatred. He shrugged. Monsters bleed like any other man. Renly exchanged a glance with Loras, who smiled faintly. Well said, the king replied. I wanted to speak to you tonight because tomorrow we march farther north. Our scouts say Tywin Lannister's men moved to intercept us near the Blackwater Rush. This is the first real test of my claim. If we can shatter Tywin, the way to King's Landing will be open. But Tywin is cunning, and the Lannisters fight like cornered lions. We could use every ounce of strength. Sandor's lip curled. So you want me in the vanguard? Renly lifted his cup, swirling the wine. Precisely. I've placed Ser Loras there, along with other skilled knights. I want you alongside them. Show my men that the one who slew Gregor stands with me, and let that strike fear into the hearts of Tywin's troops. If you perform well, you'll not only prove your loyalty to me, but you'll gain respect among the lords who still doubt you. Sandor considered. He had nothing to lose. Fine, as you command. He felt the disquiet that always accompanied the anticipation of battle. Once, he might have hidden it behind cynicism or drank himself to numbness. But he discovered that no matter how many men he killed, the fear lingered, just like the fear of fire. Some nights, he still dreamed of the flames dancing across Gregor's face, the roar of the crowd in the great hall, the ringing in his ears as he plunged his sword into his brother's neck. Yet he could not escape war. The realm was rife with it. Dawn came and the army formed ranks. Horses neighed, armor clanked, banners rippled in a slight breeze that carried the promise of bloodshed. Renly rode in golden armor near the center, flanked by his rainbow guard. Loras Tyrell was among them, wearing armor inlaid with floral motifs. Sandor took his place in the front lines. The men around him gave him space, though many peered at him in a mixture of awe and suspicion. He ignored them, focusing on the horizon. They encountered Tywin's forces late in the day, on a wide plain intersected by the Blackwater Rush. Dust kicked up as both armies maneuvered. Horns sounded. Renly's host was larger, but the Lannisters were well-disciplined and heavily armed. As the two lines clashed, the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel rose to a deafening crescendo. The world blurred into a swirl of chaos. Screams, neighs, the acrid smell of blood, the pounding of Sandor's heart. He fought the way he always had, brutally, efficiently, with no flourish. His sword sank into gaps in armor, slicing flesh. He parried blows that would have killed lesser men. The rage he once felt toward Gregor flared, fueling each strike. He found himself roaring as he cut down a knight in crimson plate. Blood sprayed across his chest, and he felt the red mist on his lips. Men died around him, horses collapsed screaming. He heard men calling each other's names, crying out for mothers or wives. Still, he fought. He had nothing but the moment, the swing of the blade, the jarring impact of steel on bone. A standard-bearer in Lannister colors rushed by, calling for reinforcements. Sandor spurred his horse forward and hacked the man down. His standard fell, the golden lion sinking into the mud. A wave of Renly's riders surged, slamming into the exposed flank of Tywin's formation. It was enough to start a rout. Through the din, Sandor glimpsed Loras Tyrell on his graceful white charger, skewering a fleeing archer. The Knight of Flowers fought with a deadly grace that almost seemed choreographed, but Sandor knew it was skill honed by countless hours of training. Nearby, Brienne of Tarth waded through the fray, cutting down enemies with her longsword, her expression fierce and resolute. Eventually, the Lannisters broke. Tywin's banners pulled back, retreating in good order at first, then dissolving into panic as more of Renly's cavalry swept in. Sandor watched, chest heaving, as the remnants of the enemy host scattered. Men lay dying or dead for a mile or more. The stench was thick. Cheers rose from Renly's camp and the golden stag banner soared high. That evening, after the battlefield was scoured for survivors and the spoils were tallied, Renly's commanders celebrated. Sandor found a quiet spot by a smoldering campfire, alone. His sword was sticky with gore, his arms aching. He was alive. He'd served his part. But the victory felt hollow. He'd seen the fear in men's eyes as he cut them down, eyes that might have reminded him of Sansa's if he let himself think too long. He cursed softly and set about cleaning his blade, scraping off the congealed blood. His gloved hand shook slightly. Whether it was adrenaline or something else, he couldn't say. A shadow fell across him. Looking up, he saw Loras Tyrell. The young knight was a study in contradictions, sweat-plastered golden-brown curls to his forehead and flecks of blood marred the intricate floral engravings on his breastplate. Yet his features still held that princely beauty. "You fought well," Loras said quietly. Renly was impressed. "The men are speaking of you, some call you a demon, others say you're unstoppable. Either way, they fear you. That might be an advantage." Sandor shrugged, focusing on his sword. "Let them say what they will. I have no care for their talk." Loras's lips quirked. "I used to despise you. After what you did at that tourney years ago, the rumors that you fought with no honor, no courtesy. But now, seeing you fight, I think perhaps we're just different sides of the same coin." Sandor snorted. "I'm no knight of flowers." A ghost of a smile appeared on Loras's mouth. "No, indeed. But I know what it means to be driven. I've heard what the mountain did to you, the scars he left. Perhaps your entire life has been shaped by that. Mine has been shaped by love, ambition, and a desire to prove myself worthy of Renly and my family. We both fight for something inside us that can't be named easily." He paused. "I suppose I want to say you have my respect, even if you'll never ask for it." Sandor stared at him for a long moment. No one had ever spoken to him that way, save maybe Sansa in her own gentle manner. He grunted, turning away. "Keep your respect. I need no man's approval." Loras inclined his head. "Very well. But you have it all the same." Then he left Sandor alone beneath the flickering embers of the night sky. Days turned into weeks as Renly's army solidified control of the region around the Blackwater, forging alliances, capturing holdfasts loyal to the Lannisters, or accepting their surrender. Scouts reported Tywin had regrouped farther west, possibly heading to protect the heartlands near Casterly Rock. Meanwhile, Robb Stark advanced relentlessly in the north, capturing strategic points in the Riverlands. Whispers circulated that King's Landing was vulnerable, with only the Boy King's incompetent rule and a skeleton force of gold cloaks to defend it. Cersei had no choice but to rely on Tyrion's cunning, but even that might not suffice if Renly moved quickly. Sandor found himself drawn into the swirl of war councils. Renly, flanked by lords from the Reach, studied maps and planned to march on the capital soon. Letters arrived from the north, from Riverrun, some secret arrangement that might coordinate attacks between Renly and the north against the Lannisters. It was all politics. Sandor simply listened, arms folded. All he knew was that every day that passed, more men died in the field or else starved in the villages. The realm was bleeding. One afternoon, as the army ready to break camp, a raven arrived bearing urgent news that changed everything. Stannis Baratheon had besieged Storm's End, claiming it by right as the Elder Baratheon. Renly received the letter with a dark expression. His plans to march on King's Landing were now imperiled. He could not allow his brother to take Storm's End, or else lose legitimacy in the eyes of his bannermen. The war took yet another turn. Renly turned his host south. The men muttered, some lords from the Reach questioned the wisdom of leaving the path to King's Landing open. But Renly insisted on defending his seat. Sandor marched with them, though he wondered if it would all end in some pointless family feud. Along the way, he saw small folk peering from huts and farmhouses, eyes wide with fear. Some approached the columns, begging for food or protection. Others hid, remembering all too well the horrors inflicted by roving armies, Gregor's outriders, Bolton's men, or Sellsword companies. Were never spared them. Outside Storm's End, they found Stannis entrenched, his own banner of the Flaming Heart flying. Tension soared. Negotiations began but seemed doomed from the start. Stannis demanded Renly bend the knee, citing his birthright and the revelations about Joffrey's parentage. Renly refused. Diplomats rode back and forth, scowling. Soldiers formed lines and sharpened swords. One night, Sandor found himself assigned to guard duty near Renly's royal tent. The night was unusually dark, the moon a silver sliver behind clouds. The wind hissed through the camp, rattling tents. Sandor stood with a pike, gazing at the horizon. He caught movement in the corner of his eye, something creeping through the shadows, sinuous and silent. A chill crept up his spine, an instinctive dread. For an instant, he thought it was a trick of the light. Then he saw it again, a shape that defied logic, sliding along the ground. He tried to move, but his body felt leaden as if fear had pinned him. He did not see what happened next, only heard the scream, a single, terrible cry from within Renly's tent. Guards rushed in, swords drawn. Candlelight flared, casting wild shadows. Sandor snapped out of his paralysis and ran, heart hammering. Inside, he saw a sight that would be etched into his mind forever. Renly Baratheon lying on the floor, eyes wide in horror, a single wound in his chest that bled profusely. Brienne knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hands stained with his blood. Loras stood just behind her, face twisted in anguish, struggling to comprehend. Renly's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Then he shuddered and died. Chaos erupted. The Rainbow Guard accused Brienne, seeing her with bloody hands. She denied it vehemently, sobbing that some shadow had killed him. Loras was near hysteria, repeating that Brienne could never harm Renly. Amid the confusion, men started to blame each other. Some claimed witchcraft, others claimed treachery. Soldiers loyal to Stannis were rumored to be behind it. Sandor felt a creeping revulsion. He had believed in no gods, no devils, but the shape he had glimpsed was no man, no ordinary assassin. Something unnatural had ended Renly's life. In the hours that followed, the Tyrell bannermen and many of the Storm Lords fled, panicked, or else sought new alliances. The host disintegrated. Loras and Brienne vanished into the night, fleeing accusations of murder. Lords parted ways. Some considered going home, some switching sides, others returning to Highgarden. Sandor was left to witness the unraveling of the grand cause he had fought for. Renly was dead. The war would shift again, and no doubt thousands more would die. And here he stood, with no king, no home, no direction once more. In the hush that preceded dawn, Sandor packed his meager belongings. He saddled his destrier, ignoring the uncertain glares of men around him. They likely wondered if he'd go to Stannis or if he'd vanish. He had no inclination to remain in a camp of leaderless knights. His vow to Renly died with Renly. Perhaps he could ride north, find work as a sellsword, or simply wander until the war burned itself out. As he turned his horse from the camp, he felt no sorrow, only a grim acceptance. A new ghost had joined the old ones in his mind, the shadow of a broken king lying in a pool of blood. He rode westward. The path took him through rocky terrain, past villages already picked clean by foraging armies. Everywhere, the realm groaned under the weight of the war. The stunted wheat, the battered windmills, the skeletal remains of once thriving hamlets, each sign told the same story. Lives were uprooted, families scattered. And for what? A crown of swords, a seat of melted steel that cut its occupant as often as not. Maybe the crows and wolves were the only true victors. One evening, he camped near a small river, letting his horse drink while he gnawed on a piece of dry bread. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of approaching rain. He watched the water flow, dark and steady, remembering the quiet nights back at Clegane's keep when he was a boy before the flames. But memories only led him back to Gregor, and he spat to chase away the taste of bitterness. A voice startled him. "Well met, traveler." Sandor's hand flew to his sword as a rider emerged from the dusk, a cloak pulled tight about slender shoulders. It took a moment for Sandor to recognize the face beneath the hood. Peter Baelish, Lord of Harrenhal now, if the rumors were true, though he rarely stayed in any one place. Littlefinger, that mocking smile playing on his lips. Sandor wondered how in the seven hells he'd stumbled upon him here. Sandor growled a greeting, not bothering to rise. "You've got nerve, creeping about like a shadow. Didn't know mockingbirds flew this far from King's Landing." Baelish smiled thinly, dismounting his horse. "A little bird told me I'd find you out here. The realm is in chaos, dear Hound, and chaos is a ladder. I like to climb. And you've done quite a bit of climbing yourself, from Lannister dog to renegade to Renly's champion, and now where will you land next, I wonder?" Sandor narrowed his eyes. "I owe you no answers." Peter held up a hand. "Of course not. But I do have a proposition. War is far from done. There are yet more moves in this game, and I suspect a man of your talents could prove instrumental." Sandor snorted. "I'm done with kings. Done with lords who fancy themselves righteous." Baelish's grin sharpened. "Oh, I'm sure. But what if I told you that the war is turning once more, that the Boy King is in dire need of swords, that the Tyrells have a fancy new arrangement with House Lannister? The alliance is sealed by a marriage, so I hear. The Lannisters and Tyrells imagine that. The city will be bursting with celebrations soon. And trouble too, no doubt. Perhaps you might find reason to return to King's Landing." At that, Sandor's temper flared. "I was banished on pain of death. Or did you forget?" Peter chuckled. "I forget nothing. But the Lannisters also forget nothing. They know your prowess. You might find them welcoming under the right terms, especially with Tywin so keen on the final victory. Or, if not them, perhaps you could find yourself in the service of another. The possibilities are endless in times like these." Sandor spat on the ground. Go peddle your schemes elsewhere." Baelish offered a slight bow. "As you wish. Still, I'll leave you with a tidbit of information. Rumor has it that Sansa Stark remains a captive in the Red Keep. She's betrothed to Joffrey, but that might change with Marjorie Tyrell's arrival. Whatever happens, that sweet girl may find herself in ever more precarious circumstances. War or no war, it might interest you to know how she fares." Sandor's teeth clenched at the mention of Sansa. He forced himself to remain still. "Why should I care?" he managed to say, though his voice was unsteady. Baelish's eyes gleamed knowingly. "A fair question. Perhaps you shouldn't. Good evening, Sandor Clegane." With that, the mockingbird mounted his horse and rode off, his cloak billowing behind him like a dark wing. Sandor sat by the river for a long time, trying to still the tumult in his mind. Images of Sansa came unbidden, her trembling lips, her tear-streaked cheeks, the raw terror in her eyes when she watched her father die. He thought of how Joffrey had tormented her at court, ordering beatings for every slight. Perhaps now that Tyrell forces were joining the Lannisters, she would be set aside or married off to some other puppet. The thought of her remaining a prisoner to that den of vipers churned his insides. Damn Baelish for his sly words. Yet the man was not entirely wrong. War churned on and the pieces moved around the board. Sandor had once insisted that he did not care for anyone. But as the night wore on, he found no peace in his own detachment. The next morning, he mounted his horse and started a new journey, one that drifted east and inevitably toward King's Landing. He moved carefully, avoiding the main roads, skirting any Lannister patrols. He had a knack for navigating dangerous territory, having once been the Lannisters' dog of war himself. His aim was unclear, even to him. Part of him wanted to see if Sansa truly needed saving. Another part wanted to kill Joffrey if he had the chance. His hatred for the boy still smoldered, overshadowed only by the memory of Gregor. But Gregor was gone and Joffrey remained. The world was not rid of monsters after all. As the spires of King's Landing came into view, Sandor tasted bitter irony. He had left the city in chains, banished for killing his monstrous brother in plain sight. Now he was back, though not openly. Smoke rose from the chimneys and the walls bristled with guards preparing for potential siege. The Tyrell alliance had brought food supplies, easing the famine, but the common folk still suffered. He entered through a lesser-known postern gate at dusk, bribing a solitary watchman who cared more for coin than royal decrees. He concealed his scar with a hood, staying off the main streets. The city smelled as foul as ever, a mixture of offal and desperation. Shouts and curses echoed in cramped alleys. He guided his horse to a stable in the backstreets of Flea Bottom, paying a stable boy a few coppers to keep silent. Under the cloak of night, Sandor slipped through the winding alleys, heading upward toward the Red Keep's looming silhouette. The castle's walls were lit by torches, guarded by gold cloaks who looked more alert than before. He would not be able to simply stroll in. But he knew hidden corners, lesser doors, from years of serving the Lannisters. With caution, he approached one such side entrance. He watched the guard shift changes, counting the intervals. Then, when the moment seemed right, he crept forward, heart pounding. He kept a hand on his sword, though stealth mattered more than violence now. He made it inside, treading softly through quiet corridors. Memories rushed back, the tap of his boots on polished floors, the heavy drapes embroidered with the Lannister lion, the hush of voices in the night. Servants slipped past, heads down, paying him little mind. He wore plain clothes, no armor, only the hidden sword at his hip. His breathing was tight with tension. He was one man against an entire castle, but if luck was with him, he might find what he sought and vanish again. The plan was simple: find Sansa Stark, see if she needed help or if she even wanted it, and decide from there. But in truth, he had no plan beyond that. He crept along a passage that led to the living quarters for highborn ladies. A pair of guards stood near a door. The corridor was dimly lit by a single torch. Sandor pressed himself to a shadowed alcove. He heard the guards talking in low voices, joking about some event in the castle. A wedding feast for King Joffrey and Marjorie Tyrell was being planned. It seemed. He waited, hoping they'd move or be relieved. But they didn't. Time dragged. At last, footsteps approached from down the corridor. A servant girl carrying a tray covered in a cloth. The guards turned, half blocking her path. She muttered something about delivering a late meal. They gave her a cursory glance, then let her through. As they shifted, Sandor seized the moment. With silent swiftness, he moved behind them, slipping past their line of sight into the gloom beyond. His heart hammered so loud he feared they might hear it. But they remained unaware. A few turns later, He came upon a smaller door he remembered leading to a suite of rooms. He tried the latch. Locked. He almost growled in frustration. Then he heard a voice from within. A soft, weary murmur. Sansa's. His chest constricted. She was alive. Before he could think it through, he rapped softly on the door with his knuckles. Silence. Then the door cracked open, a wide-eyed handmaiden peering out. She saw Sandor's scarred face and opened her mouth to scream. He clapped a hand over her mouth, feeling her tremble in terror. "Quiet," he hissed. "I won't hurt you. I need to see her." Sansa's voice came from behind the maid. "What's happening?" The maid glanced at Sansa, panic in her eyes, but dared not scream again. Sandor slowly removed his hand. The maid stepped aside, and Sansa came into view. She wore a simple gown, her red hair braided. Her eyes widened in disbelief, a hand flying to her mouth. "Sandor?" she whispered. "How?" He slipped inside, gently closing the door behind him. The room was lit by a single candle, a modest bed, a small table. Sansa's living conditions had improved somewhat from the last time he saw her, but the fear never left her eyes. He said, his voice lower than usual. "Seems I'm a ghost. Come to see if you're well." She stared at him, cheeks flushed, gaze darting around as though expecting guards. "You shouldn't be here. If Joffrey finds out, he'll kill you." Sandor gave a dark chuckle. "He'll try." He took in the sight of her, older now, the lines of girlhood softening into womanhood. But sorrow weighed in her eyes. "I heard rumors about your betrothal, or that it might change. Are you safe?" She swallowed, fiddling with her hands. The maid slipped into a corner, watching them fearfully. He set me aside for Marjorie, but I'm still a hostage here. They say they'll find another match for me eventually." She trembled. "He still torments me sometimes, threatens what he might do if my brother keeps winning battles. Lady Marjorie tries to be kind, but she can't change what he is." Sandor nodded grimly. "I've seen enough of Joffrey. He's no better than Gregor in his own way." Her eyes flickered with sadness. "You killed your brother. Why did you come back? If they catch you, there's no telling what Joffrey might do." He hesitated. He wasn't entirely sure himself. "Maybe I came to take you away. If you'll go, we could slip out, find a way north, or anywhere but this cursed city." Hope and fear warred in her eyes. "My family. If I leave, Joffrey might punish them. He has my sister still, though I don't know where. And my brother is fighting in the war. I have no way to reach him." Sandor gritted his teeth. "He can't punish them more than he already has. You deserve to be free of this place. Let me help." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She reached out, touched the ragged edge of his burn scar lightly. He flinched but did not pull away. "You're hurt," she whispered, seeing old bruises and cuts from the war. "I've had worse," he muttered. The door creaked. Sandor spun, hand on his sword. But it was only the handmaiden, half spoiled with terror, peeking into the corridor. She turned back. "We must be quick if you mean to leave," she whispered. "The guards change soon. We could slip past then." Sansa took a shaky breath. Yes, let's try. I cannot bear another day in his presence." Sandor allowed himself a grim nod. He could hardly believe the moment, but he set his mind to the task. They gathered what Sansa had, a cloak, a small satchel of personal items. The handmaiden insisted on guiding them through a servant's passage that led to the outer yard. Tense minutes followed, every step a risk of discovery. But fortune favored them. The guard shift left certain corridors momentarily unwatched. They slipped down a narrow stairwell into a dimly lit hallway that opened onto a low archway. There, Sandor paused, listening. Voices came from beyond, guards discussing some scuffle in Flea Bottom. He signaled for silence. They waited until the voices receded. Then, like shadows, they emerged into the courtyard's edge. Torchlight flickered on the walls, but no one was immediately nearby. Heart pounding, Sandor hurried with Sansa, the maid trailing behind, to a side gate used by kitchen staff for deliveries. He knew it well. If it was locked, they'd be in trouble. Miraculously, the gate stood unbarred. Sandor let out a breath of relief as they stepped into the night air outside the Red Keep. Below them, the city sprawled in a warren of streets, torchlit windows, and distant shapes. Sansa looked both terrified and exhilarated. "Where will we go?" Sandor jerked his head. "I have a horse stabled in Flea Bottom. We'll ride out. If we must, we'll take more horses. Then we head north or we find a ship. We'll figure it out." The handmaiden lingered, eyes brimming with tears. I can't leave. My family is here. I only helped you because I could not bear to see her suffer. Go, quickly." Sansa pressed the girl's hand, whispering thanks. Then the girl slipped away back into the castle. Sandor guided Sansa through the twisting alleys, a cloak pulled over her bright hair. They wove between drunkards, beggars, and watchful eyes. Sandor's scowl and sighs kept most trouble at bay. Soon they reached the stable where Sandor had left his horse. The stable boy dozed in a corner, oblivious. Sandor roused the mare, saddled her swiftly, then helped Sansa up. Flea Bottom's reek clung to them as they rode slowly through narrow streets until they reached one of the smaller city gates. A pair of half-asleep watchmen stood guard, but they scarcely roused at travelers leaving so late. Sandor handed over a few coppers and was waved through. The gate groaned open. Beyond it lay open countryside with the King's Road stretching under the moonlight. They rode in silence for a time, putting distance between themselves and the city. Only when the walls were but a silhouette did Sandor let out a long breath, tension draining from his shoulders. Sansa, seated behind him, clung to his waist. He could feel her trembling. The night air was cool on his face. He glanced back at her. "We're out," he said. "You're free." She nodded, tear tracks glistening in the faint light. "Thank you," she whispered, voice catching. Then she asked, "What now?" Sandor faced forward, the road unfurling before them like a dark ribbon. "We ride," he said quietly. "North, if that's what you want. Or maybe the Riverlands first. We'll have to steer clear of the Lannisters and the Freys. But we'll find a way. You'll see your family again." She tightened her hold on him, resting her cheek against his back. In that small gesture, Sandor felt a spark of something he hadn't recognized in years, a sense of meaning, of being more than just a killer shaped by fear. The memory of Gregor's death flickered in his mind, but it no longer felt like a curse. He had broken free of that shadow. Now, with Sansa behind him and the open road ahead, he found an unexpected solace in the night's stillness. High above, the stars shimmered. The war raged on across the realm, but for this moment they were two souls on a lone horse, breathing the quiet air of liberation. Sandor urged the mare onward. Each hoofbeat carried them farther from the nightmares of King's Landing and deeper into an uncertain future. One they would face together, forging a new role for the lone surviving Clegane in a war that had already devoured so many. Yet unknown to them both, the realm's currents were shifting. Houses rose and fell. Kings crowned and died. Battles were fought in fields and corridors alike. And somewhere, the memory of Gregor's fall at Sandor's sword remained a story told in hushed voices. The day the Hound slew the mountain, forever changing the fate of House Clegane and the shape of the war itself. The scars of that triumph would mark the realm long after men forgot what truly happened in the Great Hall. On that day when one fearsome dog broke free of his master's leash and forged a destiny of his own. They rode beneath a black sky where clouds cloaked the moon and only the faintest glimmer of starlight guided their way. Sansa clung to Sandor's back, and from time to time he could feel the trembling in her arms, the hitch in her breath. He said nothing, letting the night itself swallow up her fear. In truth, he was surprised she had the courage to flee at all. He'd expected her to vacillate, trembling and worried about her family's fate until he was forced to grab her by the wrist or give up in disgust. Yet in the end, she had chosen freedom, however perilous the road might be. They put a good distance between themselves and King's Landing before dawn teased the horizon with a faint, colorless light. The world came into ghostly focus. The rough track under the mare's hooves, the dew-shrouded shrubs, the silhouettes of trees that rose like sentinels. At length, Sandor reined the horse to a stop near a copse of oak and chestnut. He was stiff and sore from riding all night, and Sansa, unused to such exertion, shook with exhaustion. When he helped her dismount, her legs wobbled. She looked near collapse. Gently, He placed a hand under her elbow to steady her. "We'll rest here," he said, speaking low as though the silence of the dawn demanded quiet. "No one's about. If they come looking, they'll search the main roads first. We'll stay off the beaten paths." Sansa nodded. Her eyes were reddened from lack of sleep, but she managed a thin, grateful smile. He set her near a tree trunk, half hidden by brambles. The mare needed rest too, so he tied the reins to a low branch and patted the horse's neck. They had little in the way of provisions, just what Sansa's maid had tucked into a small satchel, a few lumps of bread and a wineskin filled with water. He handed the bread to Sansa first. She picked at it with delicate fingers and tried to swallow. She coughed and had to wash it down with a mouthful of water. He watched her surreptitiously, wondering if she regretted the choice she'd made. She had no illusions left about the knights and ladies in the Red Keep, but this was hardly better. She was hungry, tired, and dirty, crouched in the scratchy undergrowth. Yet he saw something else in her expression, something he could only name as relief. She was free of Joffrey's daily cruelties, free of the cage that had closed around her since her father lost his head. Sandor almost felt a pang of sympathy, a sensation unfamiliar and awkward. He swallowed it back. When she finished the bread, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple phrase, but in her soft, hoarse voice it carried an unexpected weight. He grunted. "Don't thank me yet. We've still to find a place where we can hide or get supplies. North is a long way and the war's raging through the Riverlands. Even a knight of the King's Guard would find little safety there, let alone 2 runaways." At that, Sansa's gaze flicked to the horizon. "But I have to try," she said. "My mother is at Riverrun if it still stands. Or Robb might be in the field." Worry marred her features. All these rumors about battles. I don't know if he saw her eyes brim with tears. Gently, he took the wineskin from her hand, recapped it, and set it aside. "You'll see them again," he growled. "One way or another. The worst is behind us for now. Joffrey's not out here." He spat the boy's name like a curse. "We'll rest a few hours, then move on. We shouldn't linger close to the King's Road, but we can follow smaller paths, find a farm or 2. Might be we can trade for a bit of food. I've still got a few coins left from my time with Renly's men." She nodded and let herself slide down the trunk until she was sitting. Her eyes drooped. He propped his cloak around her. The ground was no featherbed, but she seemed beyond caring. "Try to sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch." She had no argument left in her, only exhaustion. Her eyes closed and she drifted into a fitful slumber, her cheek pillowed on a patch of moss. Sandor stood watch near the horse, arms folded, scanning the horizon. The sky grew lighter, the sun a pale disk behind rolling clouds. Morning's breeze carried the smell of damp soil and last night's dew. He felt more alive out here than he ever had in King's Landing's stinking walls. The city had never been kind to him or to Sansa. Perhaps the open road would be kinder, though he doubted it. War made no place safe. He had killed his brother. The realization still sometimes rose in him like a dream. Gregor was gone. That single fact had severed the chain that bound Sandor to a lifetime of fear. Now he had to decide who he was without that shadow looming. It was an unsettling, curiously hollow feeling. There was no more monster waiting for him in the darkness. The only monster left was the memory of years lost. He tried to shake off the thought. Instead, he focused on Sansa's breathing, the hush of wind through leaves, the creak of branches. If any threat approached, he would see it first. He would kill as many men as needed to keep them from Joffrey's wrath. That was simple enough. A couple of hours later, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion fleeting across her face until recollection struck. She sat up, smoothing her skirts and hair. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "I must have been so tired." He offered her the wineskin again. "Drink. Then we ride." She drank a small mouthful and rose to her feet unsteadily. He saw the determination in her face. Despite the weariness in her body, she had a resilient core that reminded him of another Stark he'd once glimpsed, Arya, the fierce little thing, though Sansa was gentler. Both carried a certain stubbornness, but Sansa's was wrapped in courtesy and quiet dignity. He envied that sort of inner steel sometimes. His own had been forged in violence and hate. They mounted, and he nudged the mare into a careful trot, seeking out the smaller trails that paralleled the main roads. Once or twice, they had to skirt a farmhouse or hamlet. At one such place, Sandor dismounted and approached on foot, calling out for the owner. A wary old man peered from behind a shutter, a pitchfork in hand. Sandor tossed him a silver stag, which made the man's eyes widen. "Bread and cheese," Sandor demanded, "and some dried meat if you have any." The old man scurried off, returning with a small bundle. "Take care," the farmer muttered. "Soldiers come through. Burn things. Take what they want." Best be on your way quick-like." Sandor only nodded, took the bundle, and retreated. He and Sansa ate in silence, pressing forward as swiftly as they dared. The farther north they traveled, the more scars of war they saw. Villages reduced to ashes. Bodies hanging from trees, bandits or deserters or hapless souls accused of treachery, it was hard to say. Sansa's face grew pale at the sight of them, but she did not flinch as she once might have. The horrors of King's Landing had changed her, or perhaps the death of her father had hardened her to the cruelty of men. Sandor felt a quiet pang each time he saw her eyes harden. He had no illusions that the world was a kind place, but something in him regretted that she had to see so much brutality so young. Twice, they encountered roving bands of soldiers. The first were Lannister outriders, 3 men in battered crimson cloaks. Sandor caught sight of them on a slope ahead and steered the mare into dense undergrowth. They crouched there, brambles scratching at Sansa's cheeks, until the men passed. Sansa's breathing was loud in the hush, her slender body taut with tension, but the riders never spotted them. The second time, the men wore no sigil but were clearly armed. Mercenaries, perhaps, or brigands turned soldier in the chaos. Sandor quietly unsheathed his sword, but the men rode by, oblivious. They pressed on, day after day, forging deeper into the riverlands. The nights were cold now, the early spring warmth retreating behind chill winds. Sansa shivered, lacking a proper cloak, and Sandor gave her his own. He endured the cold well enough. A lifetime of war taught a man how to ignore such discomforts. By day, they studied the fields, the roads, the pattern of refugees. Many traveled east or south, fleeing rumors of battles near Riverrun. Others tried to find relatives in half-ruined towns. All of them carried haunted looks, clutching whatever valuables they had left. Sometimes children walked with bare feet, holding tight to a parent's hand. The world felt full of broken families. Sansa's eyes often welled with sympathy, though there was little they could do to help. They were fugitives themselves. One afternoon, after a week of travel, they came upon a quiet stretch of farmland near the banks of the Red Fork. The fields had been scorched in parts, but a few cottages still stood. The smell of smoke lingered, though it seemed the fires had died out some days past. Sandor found a place where an old barn stood half-collapsed. There, they tethered the mare and slipped inside, hoping for shelter. Once, some farmers' animals must have sheltered here, but now only broken beams and scattered straw remained. Sansa settled onto a makeshift pile of straw, hugging herself against the cool air. She looked so small, so frail. For the first time in days, Sandor felt the sharp pang of hunger gnaw at him. Their meager supplies were dwindling. "I'll see if I can find something," he muttered. "A henhouse, maybe? Or fish in the river." She glanced up at him. "We can go together," she offered. I can help." He shook his head. "Stay here. If someone finds you, well, you're better at looking harmless than I am. Tell them you were robbed and left behind if you must. I'll return soon." And with that, he made for the barn door. She didn't argue, only nodded, and he saw the relief in her eyes at not having to venture out again. The poor girl had walked or ridden for days on end, with little rest. She deserved a moment of stillness. Outside, the day was gray and hazy. A few crows flapped overhead, cawing at each other. Sandor picked his way through the scorched fields, boots crushing brittle stalks underfoot, until he reached a small orchard that lay behind one of the cottages. He found a half-rotten ladder and some withered apples clinging to the branches overhead. The fruit wasn't fresh, but he salvaged what he could. He worked quickly, glancing around for any sign of inhabitants or bandits. When the orchard yielded only a few wrinkled apples, he tried the cottage. The door was off its hinges. Inside, he found ransacked furniture, scattered belongings. Whoever had lived here was long gone. The pot in the hearth had been overturned, moldy scraps stuck to the bottom. He rummaged quietly, found nothing useful but a piece of flint. It might help them start fires if they lost their current tinderbox. He circled back outside. Crouching low near the cottage's side, he caught movement at the edge of his vision. He stilled, hand drifting to the hilt of his sword. Across the field, a figure in a muddy cloak was rummaging through debris, perhaps searching for loot. Sandor watched the figure for a moment. Then the person straightened, and he recognized a woman's shape. Slender, with a short bow strapped to her back. She had a wary look, her movements careful, scanning the area as though she expected trouble. Another scavenger, no doubt. He debated whether to call out or avoid her altogether. He had no interest in a fight unless she forced it. As he turned to go, a second figure emerged from behind a collapsed shed. A rangy man with a spear. He shouted something, voice muffled by distance. The woman froze. The man approached, brandishing the spear in a way that suggested he meant to threaten. Sandor waited, hidden by the half-fallen wall, wondering what the man wanted. The woman raised her hands, palms out, trying to placate him, but the spearman barked louder. Then he lunged. She twisted away, surprisingly quick, and in a flash the bow was in her hand. Sandor glimpsed an arrow nocked, a fierce tension in her posture. She loosed the arrow, and the man staggered back, struck in the thigh. He howled in pain and stumbled. She ran. The man roared in fury, yanked the arrow free in a spurt of blood, and lurched after her. Sandor scowled. This would not end well. The spearman was bigger and had a weapon suited for close quarters. The woman was quick, but she'd be overtaken eventually if the man pressed the chase. He was about to slip away. This wasn't his fight after all. But he remembered Sansa alone in the barn, and he cursed under his breath. If that spearman decided to search the area for easier prey, he might stumble across the girl. Better to handle the threat now. Sword in hand, Sandor stepped out from behind the rubble, moving swiftly toward the pair. The man saw him and froze, torn between chasing the bowwoman and facing the new arrival. Sandor used that confusion to close the distance. The spearman swung wildly, but an injured leg and desperation made for a poor combination. Sandor parried the thrust, then pivoted around the man's flank, batting the spear aside. In a single brutal motion, he slammed his pommel into the spearman's temple. The man let out a sharp grunt and collapsed, eyes rolling back. Blood streamed down his leg and from a gash on his head. The woman stared, bow still raised. Sandor met her gaze, half expecting an arrow in his chest. But she seemed more wary than hostile, lowering the bow slightly. "You just saved my life," she said. She had a low voice, throaty with caution. He looked down at the unconscious man. The fellow's chest still rose and fell, shallow with labored breaths. "He might wake soon," Sandor said. "You want me to finish him?" She grimaced, glancing around as though uncertain. Then she shook her head. No, let him bleed. The arrow did enough. He won't be walking soon." She took a slow step toward Sandor, eyes narrowed. She was older than Sansa, but not by much, perhaps in her early 20s, with a face smudged by dirt and cheeks hollow from hunger. She wore a worn cloak, a quiver slung across her back. "Who are you?" He shrugged, not in the mood to name himself. "No one," he muttered, sheathing his sword. "Saw a scuffle. That's all." She eyed his burn scar, which the weak daylight revealed starkly on his face. Recognition flickered, or perhaps just curiosity. "No one with a face like that?" He scowled. "I've no interest in sharing stories." "All right," she said. Her shoulders eased a fraction. "Well, you have my thanks, no one." Then, as if remembering something, she turned toward the man moaning on the ground. She spat in his direction, then took a step away. "I was only trying to scavenge." This bastard decided to claim what wasn't his to begin with. She paused, uncertain, then pointed to the orchard behind him. "You on the same errand?" He nodded. "Some apples. That's all." She nodded, her gaze drifting over his shoulder. "Is there anyone else with you?" He frowned. "No." Her eyes flicked to the barn in the distance, and he realized she was canny enough to guess he might not be alone. "Best to end this." "Take what you want," he said. "I'm leaving." He turned to go. "But SH." He called after him softly, "Wait. I've been scouting the fields. There's a Lannister patrol rumor to be combing the area. They've been picking off stragglers, especially women traveling alone. Maybe we should share what we've found and leave together." Sandor felt a flicker of caution. This could be a trap, yet she seemed sincere in her fear. War made alliances of convenience common enough, especially among those with nowhere else to turn. Still, he had Sansa to protect. "Not interested," he said curtly, continuing on. He expected her to protest or follow. Instead, she only shrugged. "Your choice." Then she slung her bow over her shoulder and turned away, limping slightly as she favored an old injury. She didn't so much as glance back. He looked once more at the groaning spearman. With a low curse, he stooped, picked up the man's spear, and snapped it over his knee. The man let out a delirious moan. Sandor tossed aside the broken halves. Let the bastard nurse his wound. Then he made for the barn. Sansa was right where he'd left her, but she'd risen to peek through a gap in the barn wall. When he entered, she gave him a startled look. "I heard shouting," she whispered. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "Ran into someone." "It's done." He set down the apples in front of her, half a dozen wrinkled orbs with brown spots. They weren't pretty, but it was better than nothing. She looked at them with hungry eyes. "We'll eat, then move on," he said, glancing about. "We can't stay long in case trouble's nearby." She bit into an apple, lips quirking at the tartness. Still, she ate every bit of it, even nibbling around the bruises. Sandor did the same. The fruit was mealy, but the juice quenched some thirst. "When do we head north again?" she asked. He considered. "We'll skirt the Red Fork, keep heading west for a while, then turn north once we clear the worst of the Lannister lines. If your brother's men are about, maybe we can meet them. But we'll need to be careful. Sometimes armies kill before asking questions." The words were grim truth. He'd seen it happen countless times. She nodded, brushing her fingers over her skirt, trying to wipe away the juice. "I want to find my mother or Robb," she said. "If we can get to Riverrun," she trailed off, the note of worry creeping back in. Neither of them knew whether Riverrun still held. The last rumor was that Lord Tywin had marched west after the defeat near the Blackwater Rush. Robb Stark had advanced, capturing more Lannister lands. Catelyn Stark was said to be holed up in Riverrun, negotiating alliances. Everything was in flux. Sandor rose, gathering their meager possessions. He helped Sansa onto the mare. She winced at the soreness in her legs. He gave her a moment to settle, then led them from the barn, following a narrow track toward the river. All the while, he felt the hush of the land press down, the sense that something was brewing beyond the horizon. War did not simply end because men were tired of killing. They rode until dusk painted the sky in bruised colors of purple and gray. Storm clouds gathered above, promising rain. Sandor looked for shelter, eventually finding a cluster of boulders near the riverbank. One had toppled, leaving a sloping space beneath that offered a crude overhang. There, he helped Sansa dismount and tethered the mare. They laid out straw and leaves to form some semblance of bedding. The wind had picked up, carrying a cold bite. After a time, Sansa spoke softly. "I used to think traveling would be an adventure. When I was younger, I dreamed of riding in a wheelhouse from one tournament to another, or visiting all the great castles of the realm." She let out a humorless laugh. "This is nothing like I imagined." He settled across from her, leaning his back against the largest boulder. Well, the songs never get it right. They never show the blisters, or the hunger, or the stink of fear." He folded his arms. "When I was young, I thought nights were glorious. Then Gregor showed me the truth." Mentioning his brother's name still twisted something inside him. The memory of that final duel flickered, the clang of steel, the rasp of breath, the torrent of blood. "The world's an ugly place, girl. Better to know it now than live a lie." She studied him in the fading light, her eyes solemn. "Thank you for coming for me in King's Landing. I never had a chance to say it properly. You risked your life." He looked away, unsettled by the sincerity in her voice. "I risked nothing. I'm banished either way. And I hate that place. But you risked it for me." She leaned forward slightly. "You could have left me behind." He grunted. "Didn't feel right?" He couldn't quite explain the churn of feelings within him. Pity, protectiveness, or maybe just an urge to spit in the face of the Lannisters one last time. "Don't make more of it than it is." Her brow knitted, but she didn't press him. Instead, she let the moment pass, focusing on trying to make herself comfortable on the rough ground. The night deepened. Thunder rumbled faintly to the west. Drops of rain started to patter on the boulders, a gentle whisper that soon escalated into a steady downpour. They huddled beneath the overhang, the mare shifting restlessly. The water dripped in rivulets around their makeshift camp. Sansa scooted closer to Sandor, seeking warmth, though she did so with a timid hesitation. He allowed it, draping his cloak over her shoulders. He tried to sleep, but the memories wouldn't let him rest. He kept seeing Gregor's final, dying spasm, the look of shock in those cold eyes. Then Joffrey's shrieking face, the taste of the red keep stale air. Sometimes his mind drifted to Renly's murder, that living shadow sliding through the tent. He opened his eyes, staring at the dark shape of the rocks overhead, waiting for dawn. When morning came, it arrived with fog clinging to the riverbanks, a clammy chill that seeped into the bones. They continued west, letting the Red Fork's flow guide them. Days passed in a pattern of uneasy rest, foraging for scraps, avoiding patrols. They encountered more refugees, an old couple who had once served in Riverrun's outer kitchens, a gaggle of orphans traveling with a limping donkey. Sansa did what she could for them, sharing morsels of food Sandor scrounged. Though they had little to spare, he never argued. If it brought her a scrap of peace in this nightmare of a realm, so be it. Eventually, their path diverged from the river, forced north by the shape of the terrain. Low hills rose, dotted with forests that had already shed many leaves in the unseasonable cold. Word was that unnatural storms plagued the land, and winter might come sooner than expected, though the realm was not yet due for a new season. War could upset everything, it seemed. They rode into one such forest at twilight, the trees forming a silent canopy overhead. A narrow trail meandered beneath twisted branches. Sandor led the horse carefully, trying to avoid roots that might lame the animal. Sansa held on behind him, quiet but alert. A hush lay over the wood, broken only by the distant call of a raven. Sandor's neck prickled with unease. He'd traveled enough to sense the presence of watchers. He slowed the mare, scanning the shadows. Then, as if on cue, a voice called out from ahead, "Halt, travelers!" His hand flew to his sword. From behind an oak stepped a man wearing rough leathers, a bow in hand. Another figure emerged from behind a fallen log, brandishing a spear. Sandor cursed inwardly. They were surrounded. He could sense movement in the undergrowth on both sides. No more than a handful, perhaps, but enough to pose a danger. He reined in the horse, and Sansa stiffened behind him. "We want no trouble," Sandor growled, though he remained ready to draw steel. "Let us pass." The first man, tall, bearded, and sporting a weathered face, squinted at Sandor's scar. "Might be you do. And might be we don't fancy letting you pass so easy. Times are hard. There's a toll on this road." "A toll?" Sandor's voice dripped contempt. "You mean robbery. Robbery, toll, it's all the same in these days. Coins or valuables, your pick." Sandor considered the odds. 4 or 5 outlaws, armed with bows and spears. Sansa behind him, vulnerable. If he charged, they might kill the horse or, worse, shoot her. He thought of the silver stags left in his pouch. Only a few remained. He had Gregor's old blade at his hip since claiming it after the duel, but had no illusions that swinging it here would guarantee victory. Still, surrendering everything would leave them with nothing. Before he could retort, a female voice rang out from deeper in the trees. "Hold, Will. Let me see them." A woman emerged, cloak pinned at her shoulder by a small brooch in the shape of a maiden. Her hair was dark, braided close to her scalp. She had the lean look of someone who spent long nights in the wild. As she drew closer, her gaze flicked over Sandor's face, then settled on Sansa. "Who are you two?" Sandor turned his scowl on her. "No one." Then, in the faint lamplight filtering through the branches, he recognized something about her posture, her voice. He remembered that scavenger woman near the orchard. The bow, the easy confidence. It was the same person. Her eyes flicked with the same moment of recognition. "You," she said, stepping forward. "The man with the burn scar. You saved me from that spearman." He shrugged. "So?" He glanced around at her companions, each armed. "You going to rob me now for that courtesy?" She hesitated, then raised a hand, signaling her men to lower their weapons. "We're no cutthroats. Times are desperate and we have mouths to feed." Her gaze swept over Sansa, noticing her highborn bearing, no doubt. "Is this your wife, or?" "No," Sandor snapped. "She's under my protection." He did not elaborate. Sansa kept her head bowed, but he could feel her trembling. She was remembering how easily men in the Riverlands resorted to violence. "We've little coin," he said more quietly. "A few stags, not much else." The woman's men were exchanging uncertain glances. The woman herself frowned. "We're not your enemy. If you've nowhere else, you might camp with us. We have a hidden clearing nearby, safer than traveling alone. Bandits lurk everywhere, worse than us, and Lannister patrols now and then." Sandor's first instinct was to refuse. He trusted no one, but outnumbered and with night falling, the alternative was a constant threat. Sansa touched his arm lightly. "Maybe we should," she whispered. "We have to rest somewhere." He sighed, as though put upon by fate. "Fine," he said to the woman, "but no tricks. I'll kill any man who comes near her." She gave him a tight nod. "Understood." She beckoned to her group. "Let's move." They followed the outlaws deeper into the forest. After some winding paths, they emerged in a hidden clearing circled by thick brambles. A small fire crackled at the center, around which half a dozen others lounged. Some wore battered armor, others simple tunics. Sandor saw a motley array of weapons, homemade spears, old swords, slings. These were common folk or deserters turned survivalists, living off scraps in a war-torn land. They watched warily as Sandor and Sansa arrived on the mare. The woman introduced herself as Essie, motioning for them to dismount. "Tie your horse near the others," she said. "We've a bit of feed left. Don't worry, we won't take your horse." She gave Sandor a crooked smile, trying to show goodwill. He said nothing in return, only assisted Sansa off. A stable area had been improvised near a patch of wild grass, where 2 other horses and a donkey grazed. Sandor spotted the donkey with a large pack strapped to it, possibly carrying whatever meager goods these outlaws possessed. Around the fire, Essie's people murmured in low voices, eyes darting between the newcomers and their leader. Essie took Sansa's measure, seeing the fine hands, the mannerly way she moved. "You look highborn," she said. "But I guess that doesn't matter much these days. The wars stripped everyone bare." Sansa nodded stiffly. "We have no quarrel with you. Thank you for letting us stay." Essie's lips quirked in a slight smile. "We'll see how thankful you are come morning." She turned to the others. "Let them sit. We'll share what stew we have. This is the man who kept me from being murdered by that spearman near the orchard, so we owe him that much." Sandor guided Sansa to an empty spot on a felled log. The fire's warmth was welcome after hours in the cold. The outlaws had hung a battered pot over the flames from which a thin, watery stew bubbled. The smell of onions and old meat drifted up. It was hardly appetizing, but to a hungry belly it might as well have been a royal feast. A lad with a patch over one eye ladled stew into wooden bowls. He handed them to Essie, who passed them to Sandor and Sansa. "Eat," she said, "but mind the lumps of gristle." Sansa murmured her thanks, cupping the bowl with both hands. She blew on the steaming liquid. Sandor ate warily, keeping his attention half on the outlaws around them. They wore an air of desperation but not cruelty. He saw older men with careworn faces, a few younger ones who might have been farmhands. There was even a girl no older than 10, nibbling on a crust of bread. These were not professional thieves. They were people clinging together for survival. Essie crouched by the fire, stirring the pot. She seemed to command a certain respect from the group, though no formal rank was apparent. "You've been traveling long?" she asked, glancing at Sandor. "Long enough." She nodded. "Heard any news? Of the war, I mean. We only get rumors. Some say the young wolf is unstoppable. Others say the Lannisters have new allies from the south. Still others claim the phrase turned on the Starks. Hard to know what's true." Sandor met her gaze, then jerked his head at Sansa. "Best if we speak of it later." He didn't want Sansa's identity recognized by anyone who might sell that knowledge to the highest bidder. Essie caught the hint. She nodded, turning her attention elsewhere. The group ate in subdued silence, passing around a ragged loaf of bread to dunk in the stew. When the bowls were empty, Essie clapped the lad with the eye patch on the shoulder and said, "Go fetch more water from the stream. Be quick." He trotted off, a battered pot swinging from his hand. Sansa finished her meal and set the bowl aside, hugging her arms around herself. The fire's warmth seemed to chase away some of the trembling in her limbs, but she kept her eyes lowered, as though not wanting to draw attention. Sandor quietly slid closer to her, a protective posture. She spared him a fleeting look of gratitude. Essie's men began to talk among themselves. Sandor caught snatches of conversation. Condemnation of roving Sells-words, laments about lost loved ones, speculation that maybe Robb Stark would bring peace if he took the Iron Throne. Sandor knew better. Kings rarely brought peace. Even the good ones ended up drowned in blood. He found himself glaring at the flames, half lost in thought. After a while, Essie rose and beckoned Sandor away from the others. He glanced at Sansa. She looked hesitant, but he nodded for her to stay put. Then he followed Essie to the edge of the clearing, where the light of the fire only faintly reached. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "You said you had news. I want to hear it," she said bluntly. "If we're to keep drifting, we need to know which roads are safe, which lords might still show mercy." Sandor snorted. "Mercy's in short supply. But fine." He told her of Renly Baratheon's death, of how the Tyrells then joined with the Lannisters, leaving Stannis in the cold, forced to retreat to Dragonstone. He spoke of the rumors he'd heard about Robb Stark winning battles in the west, capturing towns near Lannisport. He mentioned the phrase that they might be untrustworthy. She listened, face growing more somber with each sentence. "So it's chaos," she said when he finished. "More than we even knew. And you were with Renly once." He shrugged. I served for a time. He's dead now. She studied his face again. How does a man who once served the Lannisters, then Renly, end up wandering the Riverlands with a highborn girl on his arm? His jaw tightened. That's our affair. Essie considered pressing. Then she exhaled. Very well. But these men trust me with their lives and I have to be sure of you. You're not outlaws, so what are you? He met her gaze steadily. Refugees, like the rest. Half true. We won't harm your people. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. Sleep by the fire if you like. We stand watch in shifts. Try anything and it'll be your heads. Sandor barked a mirthless laugh. I'm not here to slit your throats. If I wanted that, I'd have done it already. Maybe so, she allowed. Then rest. We move on in the morning. We always move. He paused. Where to? Anywhere but here. We drift, set up camp for a night or two, try to gather enough food for the young ones. She shrugged. We tried to reach Riverrun once, hoping for safety, but the roads were closed off by Lannister forces. We lost 3 men. So we stay hidden in the woods now. We might push farther north soon, or maybe east. Not sure. Her words resonated with the aimlessness he felt. Why not hide at some holdfast? She shook her head. You see these folk? Most are wanted for something, even if it's no real crime. A father fought for the wrong lord, a boy shot a soldier out of fear. They're safer on the run. We're tired, but at least we've each other. Her gaze turned momentarily distant. Safer than alone. He had no answer for that. She left him then, returning to the fire. Sandor lingered in the shadows, letting the quiet of the forest settle. He thought about the path he and Sansa traveled, an unmarked road leading nowhere certain. They wanted to reach Riverrun, but if the outlaws had found the roads blocked, that might still be the case. With a low grunt, he headed back to the fire, where Sansa sat perched on the log. She looked up as he approached, concern in her face. Everything all right? He nodded. They're a band of strays, nothing more. We can stay the night. Be on guard, though. She gave a faint, wavering smile. I will. They made their beds near the fire, on a patch of ground slightly cleared of rocks. Sandor did not remove his sword belt. Sansa curled up beneath the cloak he'd given her, eyes drifting shut. The outlaws talked in low voices, but none approached them. Eventually, the camp settled. A pair of men remained awake, spears in hand, pacing the perimeter. Sandor dozed fitfully, one hand always near the hilt of his sword. Before dawn, he woke to a faint stirring. He opened his eyes to see Essie crouched near the embers, tossing a bit of kindling onto the coals. Gray light seeped through the branches overhead. He pushed himself up, joints stiff. Sansa remained curled in a ball, still asleep. The rest of the camp was silent, save for a soft murmur from the horses. Essie noticed him awake and beckoned him over. He rose and walked to the fire, rubbing the grit of sleep from his eyes. She handed him a small tin cup with water. We'll be moving soon, she said quietly. I told the others about your news. Some want to keep heading north. A few want to go east. We haven't decided. But you should know, the roads west of here might be crawling with Lannisters. One of our scouts returned before dawn, said he saw banners with the lion on red near a crossing south of Riverrun. Sandor stared into the cup. We'll deal with them if we must. She stood. ID him. You're fixed on going to Riverrun? Yes. He didn't explain the reasons. She hesitated. Look, my folk, we could use a man who can fight like you. But I see you've got your own business. If you need a guide, one of my scouts knows a back way around the main roads. He might lead you close to Riverrun's outskirts. In exchange, maybe you pay a bit or teach us some sword work. Something to help us survive. He weighed her offer. Why help us at all? Essie glanced at the sleeping Sansa. You saved me once. I owe a debt. And the girl, she's not made for a life like this. If there's a chance you can get her somewhere safe, it's worth it. Gods know we can't take on a responsibility like that. Sandor watched the flicker of the embers, thinking. All right, let's talk to your scout. They woke Sansa as the camp roused. A man named Hound, short and wiry with a missing front tooth, was introduced as the best scout among them. He claimed to know hidden paths used by poachers and smugglers between the hills around Riverrun. If I lead you, you pay, he said in a scratchy voice. Coin or something else? We could use good steel. Or do you have anything to trade? Sandor's coins were dangerously low, but they had little else of worth. The only truly valuable item was Gregor's sword. He hesitated. He'd taken the blade after killing his brother, thinking it a trophy of sorts, a symbol that he'd triumphed over the mountain. Yet ironically, the sword had become a heavy reminder each time he drew it. Glancing at Sansa, he recalled her thin, frightened face on nights they thought they might be discovered by Lannisters. What was a trophy worth if it meant wandering aimlessly forever? With a muttered oath, he said, "The sword. It's a fine blade. Valyrian steel it's not, but it'll last you 100 years. But I won't give it all at once. You get half now, half when we reach the outskirts." Haug's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Deal." He extended a hand, calloused and dirty. Sandor snorted but shook it. "All right, let's be on with it." He went to where they had tethered the mare and retrieved Gregor's sword. He pulled it from the scabbard one last time, letting the early light dance on its battered steel. It felt heavier than he remembered. After a moment's hesitation, he gripped it tight near the hilt, raised his dagger, and began to chip at the crossguard. The outlaws watched curiously as he battered the crossguard off. With the metal chunk removed, the sword looked incomplete but still very much lethal. He tossed the crossguard to Haug. "That's the first bit. You'll get the rest if you keep your word." Haug grumbled but took the trophy with a greedy grin. Essie folded her arms. "If you're leaving now, that's best. We'll move out soon as well. Gods be good to you, if any are left." Sandor nodded once. He and Sansa mounted, with Haug leading on foot at a brisk pace. The others parted to let them pass out of the clearing. Sansa cast a last glance at the outlaws, uncertain whether to thank them or simply go. In the end, she did neither, only gave a faint nod to Essie. Then they rode into the forest's dim corridors, following Haug. The path was tortuous, winding among tall stands of oak and ash. Now and then Sandor dismounted so the horse could navigate a steep or narrow stretch. Sansa walked beside him, cloak dragging in the damp leaf litter. Haug proved his worth, pointing out hidden game trails, small streams, and gullies that offered concealment from roving soldiers. They traveled for 2 days like this, sleeping under the open sky or in the hollows of old trees. Sansa's fatigue weighed on her, but she pressed on doggedly, determination shining in her eyes each time they paused. On the third day, Haug indicated they were nearing the outskirts of Riverrun's territory. The hills gave way to gentler slopes, dotted with farmland. "We go around that ridge," he said, waving his hand east, "and we'll come to a shallow crossing on the Tumblestone. On the far side, you'll be within a day's ride of Riverrun if the gods favor you." As they descended toward the crossing, the air seemed charged with tension. Sandor saw more signs of battle, trodden ground, deep wagon ruts, a broken cart half buried in mud. Sansa's eyes flickered with each new reminder of the war. Finally, they reached the crossing itself, a broad, shallow stretch of river with a stony bed. Grass grew in patches along the bank. Haug halted, turning to Sandor. "This is where I leave you. Give me the rest of that sword." Sandor dismounted, unsheathing what remained of Gregor's blade. He looked at it one last time, at the shallow nicks from where it had collided with plate in that fateful duel, at the faint engraving near the hilt. He set his jaw and handed it to Haug, hilt first. The man grinned, a satisfied glint in his eye. "Pleasure doing business. I hope you find whatever you're looking for in Riverrun, if it still stands." He turned to head back into the trees. When he was gone, Sansa slid off the mare and stood beside Sandor, gazing across the river. The water sparkled in the midday sun. On the other side, rolling meadows stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that lay Riverrun, seat of House Tully. Her eyes shone with a mix of hope and fear. "We're so close," she said softly. "Aye," Sandor answered. He had given up Gregor's sword and with it, a piece of the revenge he carried. Now he only had his battered armor and a plainer steel longsword they'd scavenged along the way, nowhere near as fine. Yet he felt oddly lighter for the loss. "Let's go," he said, taking the mare's reins. They waded into the river. The water rose to the horse's knees, lapping at Sansa's skirts. She held her breath as they crossed, scanning for any sign of watchers. None appeared. Reaching the opposite bank, they climbed onto dry land and paused, letting the horse shake off the water. Sansa looked around, brow furrowing. "We've come this far, but how do we find Mother or Robb? We don't even know if we can get inside the castle." Sandor glanced to the north. "We'll have to see who holds the gates. If the Starks and Tullis control it, we may get a hearing. If the Lannisters took it, we'll need another plan." He set his jaw. "We go carefully." They mounted again and began the final leg of their journey, heading west by the sun's guidance. The land here was in better shape than the ravaged areas they'd seen further south. They passed a few broken-down watchtowers sporting Tully banners in tatters, but at least the fields were not scorched. Crows wheeled overhead, cawing. Sometimes they smelled death on the breeze, a sure sign that battles had been fought nearby. On the second day of riding through this territory, they spotted a column of riders on a ridge. Sandor reined in, halting behind a copse of trees. The riders were flying the dire wolf sigil of House Stark. He shared a glance with Sansa. "Your brother's men," he said in a low voice. "Could be good or ill, depending on if they recognize you." Her heart leapt. "If they're loyal to my brother, they'll help us. Won't they?" Sandor raised an eyebrow. "Most likely. But we can't be sure. Soldiers can be jumpy. Let's approach carefully." They walked the mare out from behind the trees, heading up the ridge at a deliberate pace. The Stark riders saw them immediately and spread out in a half-circle. Sandor called out, "We come in peace. We have a lady of House Stark with us." The soldiers exchanged suspicious looks, glancing at Sansa with her hood thrown back. Their leader, a bearded man wearing a mail hauberk and the wolf's head pinned to his cloak, rode forward. "State your names," he barked. Sansa drew herself up, summoning what remnants of royal courtly training remained. "I am Sansa Stark, daughter of Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell. I've escaped King's Landing. This man is my companion, Sandor Clegane." A ripple of murmurs spread among the soldiers. Some recognized the name Stark immediately, others recognized the Hound. Sansa could almost feel the tension spark at the mention of Sandor Clegane. The leader scowled. "Clegane? The one who served the Lannisters? If this is some trick," Sansa's eyes glistened with desperation. "It's no trick. Please, take me to my mother. Is she at Riverrun? Or my brother Robb? I beg you." The man regarded her for a long moment. Then he squinted at her face, seemingly recalling the rumors about the eldest Stark girl. "They said you were still a hostage, and that you might be forced to marry the king." He made a sign of the seven with his hand as though warding off ill omen. "It said the Hound turned traitor, killed his own brother, then vanished." Sandor snarled softly. "He was no brother. Now, are you going to help her or not?" The soldier's lip curled, but then he exhaled. "Lady Catelyn is at Riverrun. Lord Stark, King Robb, rather, is in the field north of here. Come with us to the castle. We'll take you to your mother." He motioned to his men. "Keep watch, though. If this man tries anything," Sansa let out a sob of relief which made the soldier falter. She turned to Sandor, eyes shining. "We're almost there." Sandor nodded tersely. He didn't miss the wary glares from the Stark soldiers. Some looked like they'd happily string him up if not for Sansa. But she was the reason they hesitated. She was Stark blood, and that name carried weight. "Lead on," he said to the bearded man. The soldiers flanked them as they rode. Sandor found himself under the close scrutiny of men who had likely lost friends and kin to Lannister swords. He kept his gaze forward, ignoring their muttered curses about the Hound. Inwardly, he braced for the worst. They'd take Sansa into Riverrun, but him? He had no illusions. He was the Lannisters' dog in their eyes, no matter what he'd done recently. After a half-day's ride, they crested a hill and saw Riverrun in the distance, a majestic castle perched at the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, its walls stout and proud. Banners bearing the leaping trout of House Tully flew from the ramparts. The waters glimmered in the afternoon sun. The drawbridge stood lowered, allowing a stream of carts and soldiers to come and go. At the sight of her ancestral seat, Sansa's face lit with a fragile hope. She had never been here before, but she knew it was her mother's childhood home. They descended toward the castle gates. The men at the portcullis parted swiftly when they saw the familiar soldier leading a column under the Stark banner. The courtyard was bustling with activity, archers drilling, wounded men being carried in from distant skirmishes, stable hands rushing to tend horses. The clang of blacksmiths rang from a forge. Sandor saw the toll of war etched in every face, a mixture of fatigue and resolve. Men who had fought too many battles too soon. As they dismounted, the bearded soldier turned to Sansa. "I'll take you to your mother. As for you," he pointed at Sandor, "stay close, keep your hands where we can see them. Any false move and you'll die before you can blink." Sandor gave a curt nod, focusing on Sansa. She touched his arm. "Please come with me," she whispered. "I need you." He pressed his lips into a thin line. "They won't harm you here. It's your family's seat." "I still need you," she insisted, eyes wide and earnest. "You got me this far." He almost laughed. The notion of stepping into a castle brimming with Stark and Tully soldiers, men who had every reason to hate him, was madness. But the alternative was to let her vanish behind those walls alone, uncertain if she truly remained safe. He remembered the vow he had made himself, never to let harm befall her if he could help it. War wasn't done, not by a long shot. "Fine," he muttered. "But don't blame me if they hang me at once." Sansa's lips quivered in a small attempt at a smile. "They won't. The soldier barked an order to 2 men who took up positions on either side of Sandor, their spears ready. Then he led the way, guiding Sansa through the courtyard and into the castle's main hall. Sandor followed, the guards eyeing him every step. He kept his chin high, refusing to show fear or subservience. If they were to kill him, he'd at least face them straight on. Within the hall, the rushes had been cleared in favor of a wide war table displaying maps of the Trident and surrounding regions. Servants flitted about with parchment and ink. Scribes recorded troop movements. A knot of knights in Tully livery stood near a large fireplace, discussing something in hushed tones. At the sound of new arrivals, they turned. Sansa's eyes swept the chamber frantically until she spotted a figure standing near the high table, a woman with auburn hair shot through with threads of gray, dressed in practical but dignified attire. Lady Catelyn Stark. She looked up at their entrance, her face lined with worry. When her gaze landed on Sansa, she gasped, eyes widening as though disbelieving the sight. Then she rushed forward, arms open. "Sansa! My girl!" Her voice broke. Sansa bolted toward her mother, half sobbing. They collided in a tight embrace, tears streaming down both their cheeks. The watchers in the hall paused, exchanging confused murmurs, but none dared interrupt the reunion of mother and child. Catelyn held Sansa's face in her hands, scanning her features. "How? When? Oh, my sweet girl, I prayed the gods would bring you back." Sansa could barely speak, choking on tears. "Mother, I escaped with, he helped me. I couldn't stand another day in King's Landing," so only then did Catelyn notice Sandor, standing with 2 spearmen at his sides, his scarred face stoic. Her expression shifted from relief to alarm. She pulled Sansa behind her protectively. "Clegane," she said in a clipped tone. "You served the Lannisters." Sandor nodded, arms folded across his chest. I'm not proud of it, but that's done. I brought her here." "Why?" She narrowed her eyes. "Why help my daughter?" Sandor tried to find the words. He glanced at Sansa, who was dabbing her tears with the corner of her sleeve. "Because Gregor was a monster. Because your daughter deserved better than being a hostage to that whelp Joffrey." He shrugged, voice gruff. "I have my reasons. None of them matter if she's safe." Catelyn studied his face, as though seeking some lie or trick. She saw the intensity in his gaze, the protective stance. She turned back to Sansa. "Is this true? He's not harmed you?" Sansa shook her head vehemently. "No, he saved me more than once. We'd never have made it out of King's Landing otherwise." A hush fell in the hall. Catelyn weighed her daughter's words. The tension in her posture eased slightly, though caution still flickered in her eyes. "I owe you a debt, then, if you truly kept her safe." Her voice wavered. "But the men here have lost dear ones to the Lannisters and their allies." Sandor's lip curled. "I'll not hide from that. If you want me to leave, I will. But don't punish the girl for my presence." Sansa clutched her mother's arm. "Please, I don't want him to go. Let him stay, at least until Robb returns." Catelyn's gaze flicked between them. She took a steadying breath, then nodded at the soldiers flanking Sandor. "Escort him to a guest room. Keep him under guard. He's not to be harmed unless he tries to leave or cause trouble. Do you understand?" The guards shifted uncertainly but obeyed. Sandor inclined his head. A guest room under guard was better than a dungeon, at least. "I'll wait," he said. "Thank you, my lady." The words tasted odd in his mouth. He hadn't said thank you to a highborn in a very long time. But for Sansa's sake, he swallowed his pride. Catelyn's eyes lingered on him, a swirl of conflicting emotion in their depths. Then she turned back to Sansa, cupping her daughter's face again. "Come, my sweet girl. We must tend to you at once. You're safe now." She led Sansa away toward a side chamber, servants hurrying to assist. Sandor watched them go until they disappeared behind a thick wooden door. Then the guards prodded him. "This way, Hound." They escorted him up a flight of spiral stairs to a modest chamber with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the courtyard. One guard took station outside, and another hovered in the corridor. They closed the door, leaving Sandor alone with his thoughts. He paced the small space, ignoring the bruised ache in his muscles. The stone walls bore tapestries of fish leaping from a blue river, the Tully sigil. The bed looked more comfortable than any pallet he'd slept on for weeks. but he couldn't rest. His mind churned. He'd brought Sansa to her mother, had done what he set out to do. So why did he feel so uneasy? Perhaps because he knew that in these halls, men had fought and died to repel Lannister aggression. They would not look kindly on the presence of Sandor Clegane. Yet he could not deny a curious sense of relief. Sansa was with her kin at last, free from Joffrey's torments and the constant danger of King's Landing. He had managed something good, though he would never call himself a good man. He let out a breath, sat on the bed, and waited. Hours slipped by. A servant knocked timidly, bringing bread and stew. Sandor ate mechanically. The evening shadows lengthened. He wondered if Sansa was being fed better, if she was at peace in her mother's arms. He pictured her face as she embraced Lady Catelyn, the joy and relief shining through all the tears. That image, at least, offered a small comfort in the quiet gloom of the guest chamber. Night fell and still no word. He laid on the bed, boots off but sword belt on. Sleep tugged at him, though part of him remained vigilant. Eventually, he drifted into a shallow doze haunted by dreams of roaring crowds in King's Landing, of Gregor's gurgling last breath, of Joffrey's shrill laughter echoing through torchlit halls. He woke at times with a start, hand clenched around the hilt of the borrowed sword by his side. The night wore on. At dawn, the guard outside his door barked, "Hound, Lady Stark wants to see you." Sandor rose, stretching. He opened the door to find two stern-faced soldiers. They guided him downstairs to a smaller solar where Lady Catelyn and Sansa waited. A few Tully men stood in corners, hands on their weapons, just in case. Catelyn's expression was marginally softer than the day before. Sansa looked far better rested, clad in a clean gown that someone must have found for her pale blue, which brought out the clarity of her eyes. She managed a cautious smile when Sandor entered, though the tension was evident. Catelyn addressed him in a calm, measured tone. "My daughter tells me of your service, how you guided her through the war-torn countryside, how you protected her. For that, I'm grateful. But you understand that many here resent you." He nodded curtly. "I do. I've no wish for bloodshed within these walls," she said. "Rob is away, but he will return soon. Until then, I ask that you remain under watch. You're free to move about certain areas, the courtyard, the hall, but not beyond. Do you accept these terms?" Sandor considered. He could refuse, try to leave, but that would only confirm their suspicions. Besides, he had no desire to wander back into the chaos. At least here he could ensure Sansa was safe until her brother returned. "I accept." Catelyn studied him a moment. "So be it." She glanced at Sansa, who hovered close by. "My child, are you well?" Sansa nodded. "Yes, mother." "All right?" Catelyn's gaze returned to Sandor. "Until Rob arrives, I will treat you as a guest, with conditions. If you serve your own sense of honor, perhaps that will become a more formal arrangement." Sandor grunted non-committally, thinking that honor was a slippery word. He had never worn it well. Days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Sandor found himself confined mostly to the courtyard and the corridors around it. Soldiers eyed him with suspicion. Some spat curses at him under their breath, calling him a dog of House Lannister. He ignored them, or else gave them a stare that made them think better of antagonizing him further. He slept in the guest chamber each night, one guard posted outside. Each morning, he descended to the courtyard, where he watched men train with swords and spears. On occasion, he asked to spar with them, but most refused. Only a few braver souls stepped forward, and quickly found themselves outmatched by his brutal skill. If anything, it hardened their dislike for him, though they grudgingly acknowledged his prowess. Sansa spent her days at her mother's side. Lady Catelyn was heavily involved in war councils, receiving ravens from Robb or from envoys further north. Sometimes Sansa wandered the castle gardens, seeking a moment of peace among the rose bushes. Sandor noticed that a guard always accompanied her, not for her safety, but to ensure she didn't vanish again, or so the rumor said. Even so, every now and again, he caught glimpses of her in the courtyard, a ghost of a smile on her lips as she came to watch the men train. She'd incline her head at him if their eyes met, then slip away. One cool afternoon, he was leaning against a pillar, arms folded, when Sansa approached with a bundle in her arms. A Tully guard hovered a few paces behind. Sandor raised an eyebrow at her. "Girl," he said, in the same gruff tone he always used, though inside he felt relief to see her. She offered him a small cloth-wrapped package. "We have extra bread and cheese. I thought you might be hungry." He scowled a little to mask the warmth that trickled through him. "I've a servant who brings me meals, you know." She lifted her chin, eyes clear. "I know. But I wanted to bring this myself." She handed it over. He accepted, unwrapping it carefully. The bread was fresh, still warm, and the cheese smelled sharp and pungent. His mouth watered. "Thank you," he muttered. She clasped her hands before her. "I wanted to ask if you've heard anything about Rob or his movements. Mother says he's planning something big, but she won't share details with me. She only tells me we must have faith." Sandor shrugged. "Your brother's not fool enough to announce his plans to the entire castle. But from the talk I've heard, he's pushing deeper into the west, near the crag, maybe even seizing more Lannister lands. Word is he's unstoppable so far." Sansa's expression mingled pride and worry. "That means more battles, more death." "That's war," Sandor said bluntly, then took a bite of bread. She sighed. "I just wish it would end." He chewed, swallowing. "Might be a while. The Lannisters won't bow, and your brother won't bend the knee. And there's Stannis, too. And the Greyjoys up north. The entire realm's in a storm of swords." She looked down. "I know." Then she raised her gaze. "But at least, I have Mother. And you're safe here, too, for now." Sandor gave a low laugh that lacked humor. "Safe among men who'd gladly cut my throat, if not for you." She twisted her fingers together nervously. "Mother says we owe you a debt. She hopes Rob will see reason and let you remain unhurt. Maybe even join us." She sounded tentative. He nearly choked on the cheese. "Join the Starks." She blushed. "That might be too much to hope for, but you have skill and it would show that some of the hatred of the past can be set aside." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, thinking of how incongruous it would be for the Hound, once sworn to House Lannister, to fight beneath the direwolf banner. But then he'd sworn to Renly for a time, too, out of convenience. If fate demanded it, maybe he could swing his sword for the Starks. Robb Stark was no Joffrey, at least. The thought unsettled him, but he didn't dismiss it outright. War made strange bedfellows of men. "We'll see," he said finally. Sansa nodded, half smiling. "That's better than a refusal." Then she remembered the Tully guard behind her and stepped back. "I should go. Mother needs me." Before she left, her eyes lingered on him a moment, gentle and earnest. "Thank you, Sandor," she whispered, turning away. He watched her go, the words still resonating in his mind. She called him Sandor, not Hound. He realized he couldn't recall if anyone else in his life had ever used his true name in such a gentle tone. It left him unsettled, as though a door had opened somewhere in his guarded heart. In the days that followed, he began to notice fewer hostile glares. Oh, plenty of men still loathed him, but the rumor spread that Lady Catelyn herself had decreed that no harm was to come to Sandor Clegane. A few of the younger soldiers even approached him to ask about the battles he'd seen or to gain some sword tips. He obliged with curt instructions, more out of boredom than anything else. In that simple act, he discovered that they were not so different from the green men who'd once looked up to him in the Lannister camps. Desperation had a way of flattening hierarchies. At last, word came that King Robb Stark's host was returning to Riverrun. The castle bustled with frantic energy, banners readied, fresh straw laid in the stables, cooks preparing feast fare from whatever provisions could be spared. Servants scurried, knights polished armor, anticipating their young king's arrival. Sansa was a nervous wreck, pacing with excitement and worry. Sandor prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation with the young wolf. Robb arrived on a windy afternoon, leading a column of tired but triumphant men through the gates. His armor was worn, marked with dents from recent skirmishes, but he carried himself with the poise of a seasoned commander far beyond his years. Grey Wind, the great dire wolf, padded at his side, muzzle streaked with dust from the road. Sansa watched from the courtyard as her brother dismounted. He spotted her immediately, eyes lighting with relief and joy. She rushed forward and Robb caught her in an embrace, kissing her forehead. "Sansa," he breathed. "I thought you might still be with the Lannisters." "How?" She clung to him, tears in her voice as she tried to explain. "I escaped. Sandor Clegane helped me. He brought me here." Robb stiffened at that name. Grey Wind let out a low growl, hackles rising. Sansa tightened her hold on her brother's arm. "He's not an enemy, Rob," she insisted. "He saved my life." Rob's gaze swept the courtyard until it found Sandor, who stood near a pillar under guard. Their eyes locked. The men around Rob shifted, hands on swords. Lady Clegane stepped forward, greeting her son with a mixture of pride and concern, but Rob's attention never left Sandor's face. Grey Wind prowled a few steps closer, fangs bared in a silent snarl. Sansa and Catelyn interposed themselves gently, trying to calm the wolf. Rob lifted a hand and Grey Wind hesitated, muzzle twitching. Then Rob addressed Sandor directly. "Is it true you aided my sister's escape? You were once sworn to the Lannisters." Sandor didn't flinch. "I was. But I've no love for that whelp Joffrey. Ask your sister what happened." Rob's eyes flicked to Sansa. She nodded emphatically. "He spared me from Joffrey's men, guided me through the war-torn roads. I owe him my life. We both do." The young wolf studied Sandor a moment longer. The dire wolf let out a faint growl, uncertain. Then Rob knelt, stroking Grey Wind's thick fur. "Peace, boy. If my sister trusts him," he rose. "Well then, let it be so." Lady Catelyn placed a hand on Rob's shoulder. "He has been an uneasy guest, but a guest nonetheless. I gave him my word he'd be unharmed until you returned." Rob nodded, expression still cautious. "And I won't break your word, Mother. The man will be treated fairly for my sister's sake." He regarded Sandor. "You'll be watched, but you have my protection so long as you cause no trouble. If you wish to serve us, we can speak of that. If not, when the time is right, you may go free." Sandor exhaled slowly. It was more generosity than he had expected. "I'll cause no trouble," he said, voice thick. "The war's your business, not mine." "Good," Rob said, then turned his focus back to Sansa, pulling her into another embrace. "Let's get you cleaned up properly and fed. I'm so glad to see you safe." She hugged him fiercely, tears dampening her cheeks as Lady Catelyn stepped forward to place a tender hand on them both, mother and children reunited. Sandor felt a pang of something akin to satisfaction. This was the best outcome he could have hoped for, a family restored inasmuch as war allowed. It reminded him of all that he'd never had, but that was a personal ache he'd carry to the grave. The castle courtyard erupted in a flurry of tasks, stable hands, baggage trains, knights greeting each other. Sandor stood off to the side, no longer under heavy guard, though the men around him kept a wary eye on him. Grey Wind prowled by Rob's side, occasionally glancing Sandor's way with that lupin intelligence. Sandor stared back without fear. He respected the beast for its ferocity in the same way he might respect a well-forged blade. In some ways, they were both creatures shaped by violence. Over the next few days, King Rob held council with his bannermen in Riverrun's Great Hall. Catelyn was often by his side, offering advice. Sansa was given comfortable quarters in one of the castle towers as well as new gowns and shoes befitting her station. Servants fussed over her, which she graciously endured. At mealtimes, she was seated with her mother and brother, though sometimes she caught Sandor's eye across the hall and offered a small, shy wave. He never waved back but inclined his head in acknowledgement. The tension within the castle eased somewhat. Men were too busy preparing for the next phase of the war to focus on grudges. Rob's victories had emboldened his followers, yet the cost of constant campaigning weighed on them. Rumors circulated that Lord Tywin Lannister was regrouping a large force near Harrenhal, while King's Landing itself was under the watchful rule of the Queen Regent and Tyrion Lannister, the acting hand. Marjorie Tyrell was said to be wed to King Joffrey soon. Another alliance in the making, a swirl of possibilities and perils. One crisp morning, Sansa arrived in the courtyard to watch the soldiers practice. She still had that guard trailing her, but more as a formality now. She stood by the railing overlooking the training yard. Sandor was there, sparring with a half-dozen men. He wielded the plainer longsword he'd kept. Even with an inferior weapon, he made short work of any who challenged him. His style was direct, brutal, efficient. He disarmed one knight with a twist of the wrist, elbowed another so hard in the ribs that the man went sprawling. A hush fell among the onlookers. Sansa found herself wincing each time Sandor landed a blow, yet she couldn't look away. She remembered all too well how swiftly he could dispatch foes. When the last man staggered back, panting, Sandor lowered his blade. He turned to see Sansa watching. Their eyes met. She gave a small smile. The men around him parted, some rubbing bruises, but none daring to voice complaint. They knew a better swordsman when they saw one. Rob, from a vantage point near the armory, had witnessed the display. He He approached, gray wind padding behind him. "You have skill," Robb said to Sandor. "No doubt about that. Could be put to use." Sandor straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You want me to kill Lannisters for you? Is that it?" Robb considered. "I want to end this war and bring my sisters home. One sister is here now, thanks to you. The other, Arya, I believe is somewhere out there, possibly in Lannister hands. If you have a reason to fight them, we could find an arrangement." Sandor's jaw tightened. His reason to fight Gregor was gone. He'd already ended that life. "I'm no sworn knight," he repeated. "I've had enough of lords who promise glory. But if you cross swords with the Lannisters, I won't weep if they die." Robb nodded, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Will you ride with us when we march? Or stay behind at Riverrun?" Sandor glanced at Sansa. She stood apart, uncertain, but he could see the concern in her eyes, the worry for Arya, for her family. He knew better than to pretend he didn't care. "I'll ride," he said finally, voice gruff. "I'm tired of sitting in this castle, but I answer to no one. Is that acceptable?" Robb frowned, though not unkindly. "As acceptable as it can be. We leave in a few days for the next campaign. If you can stomach fighting alongside men who once hated you, we'll see how it goes." A wry grin tugged at Sandor's lips. "They'll hate me less if I kill enough Lannisters for them." Robb's expression softened. "Perhaps." He cast a glance at Sansa, who lingered behind the courtyard railing. Then he gestured to the battered soldiers around them. "Rest, men. You've been schooled well enough for one morning." They dispersed, leaving Sandor alone with Robb and a few watchers. The young wolf studied him a moment longer. "Treat my sister kindly," Robb said in a low voice, "and you'll find me fair. Harm her, and there's no corner of the world you can hide in." Sandor's eyes flicked to Sansa. "Understood." Satisfied, Robb gave a curt nod and signaled for Grey Wind to follow him off the training yard. Sandor stood there, catching his breath, sweat dripping from his hairline. Sansa approached, her guard trailing. "Did my brother speak to you about riding with him?" He grunted an affirmative. "Said I might join his host. Better than rotting away in a cell. Might as well do something." She hesitated. "Be careful. He fights fiercely, and the Lannisters, they won't hold back." He sheathed his sword. "Girl, I've been fighting all my life. I know how it ends." She lowered her gaze, a pang of sorrow in her features. "I wish it weren't so." He nearly reached out to brush a lock of hair behind her ear. Such a gesture was too intimate, though, and he stopped himself. Instead, he offered a terse reassurance. "You'll be safe here. Maybe, by the time it's done, your family will hold the realm and put an end to the slaughter." She swallowed. "I hope so." Then she looked him in the eye. "Thank you again, Sandor, for staying." He gave a shrug. "Thank me by staying out of trouble." A slight smile touched her lips, though her eyes glimmered with unshed tears. She turned and left, walking with the poise of a lady whose heart had been battered but not broken. In the following days, the castle thrummed with preparations for departure. Robb's host would split, one force guarding Riverrun under the Blackfish's command, and the other marching west. Scouts reported that Tywin's movements suggested a gathering storm near the borders of the Westerlands. Some whispered the name Casterly Rock, as though the final blow might be aimed at the Lannister's seat. Others spoke of potential negotiations. No one truly knew what the young wolf planned. He kept his own counsel, conferring only with a few trusted lords and his mother. Sandor readied himself in simpler armor provided by the castle's armory, unadorned steel plate that offered decent protection. He had no sigil, no house to swear fealty to. But as the men formed up in the courtyard on the morning of departure, he was among them astride a stout warhorse borrowed from Riverrun's stable. The beast was fractious, not liking his scent, but he controlled it with a firm hand. Sansa stood on the battlements with Lady Catelyn, watching the columns form. She wore a gray cloak trimmed with white fur, the wind tugging at her auburn hair. From below, Sandor caught her eye. She managed a brave smile, though her hands clutched the battlement's stone edge. He wondered if she feared losing him to the same war that had swallowed so many. The thought shouldn't have mattered to him, but in a small, hidden part of his heart it did. Rob rode at the head of the column, Grey Wind trotting beside him. Horns sounded echoing off Riverrun's walls. The gates swung open. One by one, knights, mounted archers, and foot soldiers poured out onto the road. Sandor nudged his horse forward, falling in behind a line of cavalry. The sun rose over the castle turrets, gilding them in gold light. For a moment, the reflection stung his eyes, reminding him of King's Landing's red walls. But this was not that place. Sansa was not that frightened girl cowering on the steps of the Great September, and he was no longer the dog of House Lannister. They rode out, the banners of House Stark and House Tully snapping in the breeze. The war would continue, blood would be spilled, and alliances tested. Yet House Clegane, once overshadowed by the Mountain's cruel legacy, had found a new path in the unlikeliest of ways, through the broken fear of a scarred man who slew the monster that shaped him, and the quiet strength of a highborn girl who saw something more in him than just a hound on a leash. How it all would end was a mystery, but for now, they pressed on, forging a different fate than the one Joffrey or Tywin or even the gods themselves might have imagined. The open road beckoned, and with it, the uncertain hope that perhaps, at last, the realm would know a measure of justice, one sword stroke at a time.